There is a show that has been on television longer than most of the people watching this video have been alive. It started quietly, tucked at the end of a Christmas special in December 1989, back when the world was a very different place. The Berlin Wall had just come down. The internet was not yet something that ordinary people touched in their daily lives. Cell phones were the size of bricks, and most households did not have one. A yellow cartoon family sat on a couch in a town called Springfield, and a studio audience laughed somewhere, and the credits rolled, and nobody in that room had any real idea what they had just witnessed the beginning of. 36 years later, The Simpsons is still on the air. 800 episodes and counting. That is the kind of number that stops being a statistic and starts being something closer to a geological fact, like the depth of a canyon that took millions of years to carve. The show has been running for so long that it has outlasted the careers of politicians who were first elected after it premiered. It has outlasted technologies and cultural movements and entire generations of television trends that rose and fell while Springfield stayed exactly the same. And that last part is where things start to get genuinely interesting, because the show has been on for 36 years, and in all that time, the Simpson family has not aged a single day. Bart is still 10, Lisa is still 8, Maggie is still that same 1-year-old, still clutching her pacifier, still watching everything with those enormous eyes that never seem to miss a single thing, even when every adult around her assumes she cannot possibly be paying attention. Homer is still somewhere in his mid-30s, still driving to the same nuclear power plant every morning, still taking the same seat at the same console in front of the same reactor core that has been quietly failing its safety requirements for 3.5 decades. Marge's hair still reaches that same impossible height without any visible effort on her part, the same particular shade of blue across all 800 episodes. Springfield should look different. It should have scars and wrinkles, and the kind of accumulated weight that comes from living through actual time. Instead, it keeps going. This perpetual present, this town that exists in a kind of permanent now, where the same yesterday plays every morning and tomorrow never quite shows up. That is the surface of the iceberg. And if you have watched The Simpsons the way most people watch it, casually, with affection but without close attention, you probably know that much. You know the donuts. You know dough. You know excellent. You know the couch gag and the chalkboard and the yellow skin and the 4 fingers and the opening theme that has been played often enough to be physically embedded in the nervous systems of an entire generation. You know Springfield the way you know a place you have driven past 100 times without ever stopping to go inside. This video is about going inside. The Simpsons Iceberg is not a new concept. It has been circulating in fan communities for years in various forms. The basic idea is simple. Take everything there is to know and say about the show and arrange it in layers. From the things everyone already knows at the top to the things that require real sustained attention, real archival work, and sometimes a genuine willingness to sit with deeply uncomfortable conclusions, down at the very bottom. Version 5 of this iceberg goes deeper than the earlier versions. It covers territory the previous ones only touched the edges of, or addressed too briefly to do justice to. It includes things that have come to light in the years since the last major iceberg was compiled, discoveries made by dedicated fans and archival researchers, and in a few cases the show's own writers, who have occasionally let something slip in interviews or DVD commentaries that opens questions they clearly never intended to open. Here is how tonight is going to work. We descend together through 10 layers, starting at the surface with familiar territory and moving slowly downward into darker and colder water. The deeper we go, the stranger things get. The more the show's familiar comedy exterior starts to peel back and reveal something underneath that is harder to classify, something darker and more intricate and, in some ways, genuinely more beautiful than the version most people carry in their heads. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly what this is designed for. The pace is unhurried. There is no urgency. We are not rushing toward anything. We are walking through Springfield together, slowly, looking carefully at things that most people walk past without stopping. If sleep finds you somewhere between Section 3 and Section 7, that is completely fine. Springfield will still be here when you drift back. It always is. That is practically the show's thesis statement. Before we go any further, let me tell you a little about the iceberg concept itself, because understanding the structure helps. An iceberg is a useful metaphor because of the specific geometry it describes. The part above water, the visible tip, is a small fraction of the total mass. Most of an iceberg exists below the surface, hidden from anyone looking down from above. The visible part is real, but it is misleading. It suggests a scale that dramatically understates the whole. If you look at the top of an iceberg and assume you understand the iceberg, you understand almost nothing about it. The Simpsons Iceberg works the same way. The top layer is the show as most people experience it. It is enormous by any measure. The Simpsons is one of the most culturally significant pieces of media the 20th century produced. It shaped how Americans talk, how they think about television, how they imagine the working-class family, how they process satire. The top of this iceberg is genuinely impressive, but below it, hidden from the casual viewer, is a staggering amount of additional material. 36 years of production decisions made by extraordinarily intelligent people who cared deeply about what they were making. 36 years of continuity, which means 36 years of things that contradict each other and things that line up in ways that seem impossible. 36 years of fan analysis, theory construction, archival research, and the kind of obsessive attention to detail that produces insights so specific and so carefully argued that the show's own creators have had to address them publicly. All of that is below the waterline. We are going to visit all of it. There is something worth establishing before we descend any further. Something about the experience of rewatching The Simpsons as an adult that most analyses skip over because it seems obvious, but that is actually the key to everything that follows. When you rewatch the Golden Era episodes with adult eyes, something specific happens. You watch something you remember as a comedy, something that made you laugh when you were younger, and you find that it is not primarily funny when you watch it now. It is primarily sad, or primarily troubling, or primarily something that does not have a clean single-word description. The jokes are still there, and they still work. But underneath them is a layer of genuine grief or longing or fear that the comedy was originally obscuring, or that you were originally too young to perceive underneath the laughter. This is not an accident of memory or nostalgia. The show was built this way. The Golden Era writers were extraordinarily skilled at constructing emotional experiences that functioned on multiple levels simultaneously, and the emotional level they were most consistently and most sophisticatedly developing was the one they covered most carefully. The darker psychological reality of the Simpson family's lives. You notice that Homer is not just a lovable idiot. He is a man who is genuinely afraid of almost everything, whose humor functions as a defense mechanism deployed to avoid sitting with feelings he does not have the vocabulary to process. You notice that Marge is a person who has systematically suppressed an enormous amount of herself in order to function as the family's emotional anchor, and that the show occasionally lets you see what that suppression costs her before it closes the window and returns you to the comedy. You notice that Bart's rebelliousness is something that looks more like a survival strategy than a personality trait, a set of behaviors developed by a child who has been labeled as a problem and who has decided that if that is the role he is being cast in, he might as well commit to the performance. You notice that Lisa's isolation is genuine loneliness, the kind that does not resolve at the end of an episode. You notice, in short, that The Simpsons has always been a show about people in pain who are very funny about it. That is the surface of the iceberg, and it is already richer than most people see. Get comfortable. The world outside can go quiet. The show has been running for 36 years. There is no rush here, and nothing that needs to happen quickly. Before we go any further, drop a comment and let everyone know what time it is where you are and where in the world you are watching from. This video reaches people in more places and at more hours than you might imagine, and there is something genuinely lovely about knowing that. If you are enjoying what this is so far, the subscribe button is right there. Now let's keep going. There is a question that sits at the beginning of any serious attempt to understand The Simpsons. A question that sounds simple but gets more complicated the longer you hold it. The question is, what is this show actually about? The surface answer is obvious. It is about a cartoon family in a fictional American town. It is a comedy. It has been on for a long time. People like it. But that surface answer does not explain the quality of the attention that the show attracts. It does not explain why, of all the many hundreds of long-running television programs that have existed since the medium was invented, The Simpsons is the one that has generated the most sustained, most sophisticated, most genuinely productive fan analysis. It does not explain why people who have watched the show for 36 years still find things in it they had not previously noticed. It does not explain why the theories and the mysteries and the patterns keep accumulating, keep producing new material for people to think about and discuss and argue over. Those things only happen to work that is genuinely rich, work that has more in it than the surface presence, work that was made by people who cared about what they were making and who put things into it that they cared about, things that are still there, still communicating, still being discovered by people who care enough to look. That is what the iceberg is evidence of. Not just the show's longevity or its cultural footprint, but its depth. The depth that justifies the attention, that makes the analysis rewarding rather than arbitrary, that means there is always something more to find. We are going to find some of it tonight. It started quietly, tucked at the end of a Christmas special in December 1989, back when the world was a different place entirely. The Berlin Wall had just come down. The internet was not yet a thing that regular people touched. A yellow cartoon family sat on a couch in a town called Springfield, and the studio audience laughed, and the credits rolled, and nobody in that room had any idea what they had just witnessed the beginning of. 36 years later, The Simpsons is still on the air, still running, still producing new episodes, new jokes, new moments. It is the longest-running American animated series in history. It is the longest-running primetime scripted show in the history of American television, period. 800 and counting. That is the kind of number that stops being a statistic and starts being something closer to a geological fact, like the age of a mountain range or the depth of a canyon. The Simpsons has been running for so long that it has outlasted the careers of politicians who were elected after it premiered. It has outlasted technologies, cultural movements, entire generations of television trends that rose and fell while Springfield stayed exactly the same. And that last part, the staying exactly the same, is where things start to get interesting. Because the show has been on for 36 years, and in all that time, the Simpson family has not aged a single day. Bart is still 10, Lisa is still 8, Maggie is still that same 1-year-old, still clutching her pacifier, still watching the world with those enormous eyes that never seem to miss anything. Homer is still somewhere in his mid-30s, still driving to the same nuclear power plant every morning, still taking the same seat at the same console in front of the same reactor core that has been leaking in the same ways for 3.5 decades. Springfield should be different. It should have scars. It should have wrinkles and gray hairs and the kind of accumulated weight that comes from living through decades of genuine time. Instead, it just keeps going. This perpetual present, this town that exists in a permanent now, that is the surface of the iceberg. And if you have watched The Simpsons casually, if you know the show the way most people know the show, you probably know that much. You know Homer says, "Do not have a cow, man was Bart's thing." You know the donut, you know dough, you know Mr. Burns and his excellent. You know the couch gag and the chalkboard and the school bus and the opening theme. You know Springfield the way you know a place you have driven past 100 times without ever stopping to go inside. This video is about going inside. The Simpsons Iceberg is not a new concept. It has been circulating in fan communities and analysis spaces for years. The basic idea is simple. You take everything there is to know about The Simpsons and you arrange it in layers, from the things everyone knows at the top to the things that require serious study, serious attention, and sometimes a willingness to sit with genuinely uncomfortable conclusions down at the bottom. Version 5 of this particular iceberg is different from the earlier ones. It goes deeper. It covers territory that the previous versions only touched the edge of. It includes things that have come to light in the years since 5.4, discoveries made by dedicated fans, researchers, and in a few cases, the show's own writers, who have occasionally let something slip in interviews or DVD commentaries that opens up questions they clearly never intended to open. So here is how tonight is going to work. We are going to descend together through 10 layers of this iceberg, starting at the surface with the things you probably already know, the gentle, familiar territory, and moving slowly downward into deeper water. And the deeper we go, the stranger things get. The more the show's familiar comedy exterior starts to peel back and reveal something underneath that is harder to classify, something darker and more intricate and in some ways genuinely more beautiful than the version of the show that most people carry around in their heads. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly what this is designed for. The pace here is unhurried. There is no urgency. We are not rushing toward anything. We are just walking through Springfield together, very slowly, looking at things that most people walk past without stopping. And if sleep finds you somewhere between Section 3 and Section 7, that is completely fine. Springfield will still be here when you drift back. It always is. Let me tell you a little about the iceberg concept itself before we start descending, because understanding the structure helps you appreciate what we are doing. An iceberg is a useful metaphor precisely because of the specific geometry it describes. The part above water, the visible tip, is actually a small fraction of the total mass. Most of an iceberg exists below the surface, hidden from anyone looking down from above. The visible part is real, but it is misleading. It suggests a scale that understates the whole. The Simpsons Iceberg works the same way. The top layer is the show as most people experience it. The jokes, the characters, the catchphrases, the cultural footprint. It is enormous by any reasonable measure. The Simpsons is one of the most culturally significant pieces of media the 20th century produced. It has shaped how Americans talk, how they think about television, how they imagine the working-class family. The top of this iceberg is genuinely impressive, but below it, hidden from the casual viewer, is a staggering amount of additional material. 36 years of production decisions, each one made by a room full of extraordinarily intelligent people who cared deeply about what they were making. 36 years of continuity, which means 36 years of things that contradict each other, and things that line up in ways that seem impossible, and things that were planted in early seasons and never resolved, and things that the writers intended one way, that the audience interpreted another way, and the questions that get raised by both. 36 years of fan analysis, theory construction, archival research, and the kind of obsessive attention to detail that produces insights so specific and so well supported that the show's own creators have had to address them publicly. All of that is below the waterline. We are going to visit all of it. The first section, this one, lives right at the surface. We are going to talk about what The Simpsons actually is, what it set out to be, what it became, and why the fact that it is still running is, in itself, one of the strangest things about it. This is the territory most longtime fans know. If some of it is familiar, that is intentional. We are building a foundation before we start digging. The Simpsons began as a series of short animated segments on The Tracy Ullman Show, a comedy variety program on the newly launched Fox network. Matt Groening, the show's creator, pitched the characters as a rapid-fire series of 30-second vignettes, a slightly rough-looking animated family who lived in a mid-American suburb and argued about ordinary things. The design was deliberately crude, partly as an aesthetic choice and partly because the animation budget was thin and the timeline for production was tight. When Fox decided to develop the shorts into a half-hour series, Groening and his collaborators, James L. Brooks and Sam Simon, had to make decisions about what the show actually was. Was it a children's cartoon, like the Saturday morning fare that had dominated animation for decades? Was it an adult comedy that happened to be animated? Was it satire, parody, something else entirely? The answer they arrived at, almost by accident, was all of the above and none of them completely. The Simpsons was, from its first full episode, a show that refused to sit still in any single genre. It was funny in the way that adult comedy was funny, with jokes that rewarded knowledge and attention and sometimes required the viewer to have a certain amount of cultural literacy. But it was also emotionally sincere in a way that animated television had rarely attempted before. The Christmas episode that served as the pilot, the one where Homer struggles to find money for presents and ends up bringing home a racing dog that cannot race, is not primarily a comedy. It is a story about a father's fear of failing his family, and it is told with a gentleness that catches you off guard. That combination, the comedy and the sincerity existing side by side without one undermining the other, was what made The Simpsons extraordinary. Other shows had been funny. Other shows had been emotionally honest. The Simpsons was both, simultaneously, and it did it so naturally that it made both things look easy. It was not easy. The writing staff that Groening and his collaborators assembled in those early seasons was something unusual in the history of television comedy. They hired people from the Harvard Lampoon, which was the pipeline that had been feeding talent to Saturday Night Live and various other prestigious comedy institutions for years. But they also hired people with backgrounds in mathematics, in philosophy, in literature. They hired people who had studied science and people who had studied history and people who had, in one case, a PhD that was largely unrelated to comedy writing, but who turned out to be very good at building jokes around complex ideas. The result was a writing room that thought about The Simpsons the way an architect thinks about a building. The jokes were not just jokes. They were constructed things, with foundations and load-bearing elements and carefully considered relationships to everything around them. A callback in Season 4 was not accidental. It was placed there by someone who remembered a line from Season 2 and understood how the two moments would resonate against each other. The recurring gags, the ones that stretched across many episodes and many years, were not lazy repetition. They were deliberate architecture. This matters for the iceberg because it means that almost nothing in the show's early seasons is accidental. The things that seem like throwaways, the background details, the single-episode characters who say something odd and vanish, the moments that feel like non-sequiturs, most of them are intentional. They are either jokes that reward close attention, or they are seeds that were planted without a specific plan, dropped into the soil of Springfield with the vague idea that they might grow into something if the right season came along. Some of them grew, some of them did not. And the ones that did not, the abandoned storylines, the characters who were introduced and then quietly forgotten, the continuity threads that got dropped mid-pull, those are some of the most interesting things on this iceberg. Because you can look at the hole left by something that was planted and never harvested, and sometimes, if you look carefully enough, you can tell what it was supposed to become. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. We are still at the surface. Here is something worth settling into before we go any deeper. The experience of rewatching The Simpsons as an adult, if you grew up with the show, is a specific kind of disorientation. You remember the episodes from childhood. You remember the jokes, the voices, the way Springfield looked in the golden era seasons with that slightly warm, slightly saturated color palette that the animators used before the move to digital production changed everything. You remember it as a comedy show, something bright and fast and funny. And then you watch it again, older, and you start noticing things. You notice that Homer is not just a lovable idiot. He is a man who is genuinely afraid of almost everything, and whose humor is often a defense mechanism deployed to avoid sitting with feelings he does not have the language to process. You notice that Marge is not just the patient, long-suffering wife. She is a person who has systematically suppressed an enormous amount of herself in order to function as the family's emotional anchor. And the show occasionally lets you see what that suppression costs her, and then it closes the window before you can look too long. You notice that Bart's rebelliousness is not a personality trait so much as a survival strategy developed by a child who feels invisible in his own family. You notice that Lisa's isolation is not just the price of being smart in a town that does not value intelligence. It is loneliness. Actual loneliness. The kind that does not resolve at the end of an episode and starts the next one exactly where it left off. You notice, in short, that The Simpsons has always been a show about people in pain who are very funny about it. That is the surface of the iceberg, and it is already more than most people see. Below it is everything else. And tonight we are going to spend time with all of it. Slowly. Without hurry. There is nowhere to be. Springfield is not going anywhere. Bart will still be 10 when we finish. The cooling towers will still be leaking. The donut will still be on Homer's console. We have time. So get comfortable. Let the familiar yellow of Springfield settle around you. Let the sounds of the show, the theme you have heard hundreds of times, the laughter track, the specific acoustic texture of Springfield that the sound designers created and maintained for 36 years, let all of that become the background of wherever you are right now. The iceberg goes very deep. We are just getting started. Before we go any further, drop a comment and let everyone know what time it is, where you are, and where in the world you are watching from. And if you are enjoying this kind of deep, slow breakdown, the subscribe button is right there. It genuinely helps. Now, let's go deeper. Every iceberg has a layer just below the waterline that is still mostly familiar. You can see it through the surface if the water is clear and the light is right and you lean over the edge and look carefully. It is not the stuff that everyone already knows without thinking about it, but it is the stuff that devoted fans and curious people tend to encounter first when they start looking a little harder at something they have always loved without having fully examined it. For The Simpsons, this layer is full of things that feel like common knowledge within the fan community, but that would genuinely surprise a casual viewer who has only ever watched the show without thinking too carefully about what they were watching. The production trivia that deepens into something stranger the more you sit with it. The recurring gags that have backstories. The surface contradictions that point toward much deeper ones once you start pulling on the thread. Let us begin here and go slowly, because each of these surface-level things has more inside it than it appears to from the outside. You can see it through the surface if the water is clear and the light is right. It is not the stuff everyone knows, but it is the stuff that devoted fans and curious people tend to encounter first when they start looking a little harder at something they love. For The Simpsons, this layer is full of things that feel like common knowledge within the fan community, but that would surprise a casual viewer who has only ever watched the show without thinking too hard about it. This is the layer of production trivia that deepens into something stranger the more you sit with it, of recurring gags that have backstories, of surface contradictions that point toward deeper ones. Let's start with Bart's prank calls to Moe's Tavern, because they are one of the most iconic running gags in the show's history, and they have a history of their own that most people do not know. Every few episodes, particularly in the earlier seasons, Bart picks up the phone and calls Moe's Tavern. He asks Moe to page a customer with a name that, when Moe reads it aloud, reveals itself as a vulgar joke at Moe's expense. The bar's patrons laugh. Moe, livid, threatens violence against whoever is calling. Bart hangs up, satisfied. The gag is simple, and its longevity in the show's early run is partly a testament to the writer's ability to generate an apparently inexhaustible supply of names that function as juvenile wordplay. But what most viewers do not know is that the joke has a real-world origin that predates The Simpsons entirely. Before the show existed, there was a recording called the Tube Bar Tapes, a series of prank calls made to a bar in Jersey City, New Jersey, by two men who went by the pseudonyms John and Jim. The bar was operated by a man named Louis Red Deutsch, who had a famously short temper and a particular gift for profane outrage when provoked. The callers would ask for fictitious customers with names designed to embarrass Deutsch when he called them out to the bar, and Deutsch is furious. Increasingly creative responses became the raw material for an underground recording that circulated on cassette tape through comedy and music circles for years. The recordings were beloved by people who encountered them. Tom Waits was a known admirer. Beavis and Butthead creator Mike Judge cited their influence. And the writers of The Simpsons, when they were looking for a recurring bit for the show's bar scenes, drew directly and knowingly on the tube bar tradition. Moe is not a wholly original creation. He is a specific character type with a specific comedic lineage, and Bart's calls to the tavern are a conscious homage to something that existed before anyone in Springfield was ever drawn. What makes the tube bar connection interesting beyond simple trivia is what it reveals about the sensibility of the early writing staff. These were people who had absorbed an enormous amount of American popular culture, high and low simultaneously, and who understood how to use that material in ways that worked on multiple levels at once. The Moe prank call gag is funny to someone who has never heard of the tube bar tapes, and it is also, for the much smaller audience who knows that history, a kind of coded acknowledgement, a comedy inside the comedy. This doubled structure, the surface joke and the submerged one, is something the early show did constantly and consistently, and it is one of the primary reasons the show rewards close attention, in a way that most television comedies do not. The specific construction of the prank call names deserves a moment of attention, because their construction is more careful than it appears. Each name needs to function simultaneously as a plausible name, plausible enough that Moe would read it aloud without hesitation, and as a vulgar joke when spoken aloud in context. The balance between plausibility and comedy is something that requires real craft to maintain across dozens of iterations. The names that the writers generated were, in almost all cases, exactly right. Plausible enough to work as the setup, funny enough to justify the bit. This is not easy. The apparent ease is the result of the writing room's specific standards being applied to what looks like a throwaway gag. The evolution of the prank call bit across the show's seasons tracks something interesting. The early calls are simple. The names are straightforward wordplay, accessible to anyone willing to hear them out loud. As the show continued, the prank call structure became more elaborate and more self-aware, incorporating references to the fact that Moe always falls for it, incorporating moments where the gag's own repetition becomes part of the comedy. By the middle seasons, the prank call was not just a bit, it was a meditation on a bit, a comedy that included its own history as part of its content. And then, as the later seasons moved on and the show's relationship to its own golden era became more complicated, the calls became less frequent and less sharp. Their decline tracks, in miniature, the broader arc of the show's relationship with its own best material. This matters for a reason beyond trivia. It is evidence of something the early writing staff did consistently. They took the cultural material they loved, the things from comedy, history, and pop culture that delighted them, and they embedded it inside the show in ways that would work on the surface as pure entertainment, while also functioning as a kind of love letter to the people who would recognize the reference. The Simpsons in its golden era was always doing at least two things at once. The joke that makes you laugh without thinking about it, and the joke underneath the joke that rewards the person who does. Now let's talk about the chalkboard gags, because they have a history that most people summarize incorrectly. The opening sequence of The Simpsons begins with Bart writing lines on a chalkboard in his classroom. The lines are always different. They are always a joke or a commentary or a piece of absurdist self-referential humor, and they change every episode. This is common knowledge. What is less commonly known is that the chalkboard gag was not part of the original concept. It was added during production of the first season, when the creative team realized they needed a way to open the sequence that could be varied easily between episodes to prevent the opening credits from becoming static. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. Bart writing punishment lines on a chalkboard is perfectly in character. It requires no setup or explanation. It can change completely from episode to episode without affecting anything else. And because it changes every time, it gives attentive viewers something to watch for, a small reward for paying attention to something they might otherwise tune out. What makes the chalkboard gags genuinely interesting to study is watching how they evolved across the show's run. In the early seasons, the gags are mostly simple rule-breaking jokes, the kind of thing a mischievous 10-year-old might think was hilarious. They are in Bart's voice. They have the energy of a kid who has been caught doing something wrong and is delighted about it. They are funny in the way that transgression is funny when it is small-scale and consequence-free. As the seasons progressed, the chalkboard gags started doing other things. Some of them became meta-commentary on the show itself, acknowledging episodes that had been controversial, or gags that had not landed, or decisions that the writers were processing publicly through the character of a 10-year-old writing on a board. Some of them became political commentary, using Bart's voice to say things about the real world that the show was reluctant to address directly through its plot. Some of them became elegies, written in memory of cast members or crew members who had died, quietly honoring people who the audience might not have heard of outside the chalkboard. The transition in the tone and content of the chalkboard gags across the show's run tracks the evolution of the show itself with surprising accuracy. You can read the emotional temperature of any given season partly by looking at what Bart is writing on that board. The gags get more self-aware, more politically engaged, and occasionally more melancholy as the decades accumulate. The show is always doing something with that chalkboard, even when it looks like the same joke it has always been. The couch gag is the other bookend of the opening sequence, and it has a history that makes the chalkboard story look simple by comparison. The couch gag, for those who need a reminder, is the moment near the end of the opening theme when the Simpson family races home and sits down together on the living room couch to watch television. Like the chalkboard, it changes every episode. Unlike the chalkboard, it has over the years become a legitimate showcase for animation, a canvas for some genuinely remarkable creative work. The original couch gags were practical solutions to a timing problem. Different episodes have different lengths, and the opening sequence needed to be flexible enough to accommodate those differences without running over or coming up short. By varying the length of the couch gag, the production team could calibrate the opening to fit whatever was needed. The couch gag was, in its first form, a technical tool. What it became over time is something much harder to categorize. By the mid-90s, the couch gag had evolved from a timing solution into a creative opportunity. The writers and animators started treating it as a space for experimentation, for visual jokes that would not have fit anywhere else in the show. The gags started getting more elaborate. Characters would arrive to find the couch occupied by strange figures, or the couch itself would be in an impossible place, or the entire family would be transformed into something unexpected. The animation style would change, departing from the show's standard look to parody a different aesthetic entirely. This escalation continued until the couch gag became one of the most anticipated parts of any new episode for dedicated viewers. Fan communities track and catalog every couch gag. They debate which ones are the best. They discuss what specific gags might mean in the context of the episode they precede, whether the choice of couch gag represents a deliberate creative decision by the episode's director, or whether it is more or less random. Some of the most remarkable couch gags were created by guest directors and animators who were given the space to do essentially whatever they wanted within the 2 to 3 minute window. The French filmmaker Sylvain Chomet created one that was a complete short film in miniature, entirely in his own visual style, completely unlike anything the show had ever produced before. The designer and filmmaker Don Hertzfeldt created a couch gag that was genuinely disturbing, an abstract, glitching nightmare version of Springfield that felt like the show's visual language had been infected by something wrong. These guest-directed couch gags are interesting for a specific reason. They reveal what The Simpsons looks like through other eyes. When Hertzfeldt runs his visual sensibility through the familiar Springfield iconography, what comes out is alien and unsettling. The characters you know become unfamiliar. The colors are wrong. Something has gone wrong with the world in a way that is hard to articulate but impossible to ignore. And some fans argue that Hertzfeldt's couch gag is not just a stylistic experiment. They argue it is the show making a statement about itself, using the borrowed eye of an outsider to show the audience what Springfield actually looks like when you remove the comfort of the familiar aesthetic. The Springfield of that couch gag is not a warm, funny place. It is disorienting and wrong and slightly horrifying. Which is, if you think about it, exactly what Springfield is when you stop accepting it on its own terms. The couch gag's evolution as a creative form also raises a question worth sitting with. When does a production tool become an artistic statement? The original couch gag had no artistic ambition. It was a timing mechanism, a way to make the credits fit. The current couch gag is often a significant creative work in its own right, sometimes more interesting and more formally ambitious than the episode it precedes. This transformation happened gradually, through the accumulation of many small decisions by many different people, none of whom necessarily set out to make the couch gag into what it has become. There is something deeply Simpsonian about this. So much of what makes the show remarkable was not planned in advance. It emerged from the collision of specific people with specific sensibilities in a specific moment, producing something that none of them fully anticipated. The couch gag as a major creative format is a small-scale version of the show itself, a practical solution that became something far beyond its practical function through the sustained application of genuine creative intelligence. The specific couch gags that have entered fan consciousness as the most discussed and most revered tend to share a quality of surprise. Not surprise in the sense of being unexpected within the format, since the couch gag is by definition variable, but surprise in the sense of making the viewer briefly see the show, and Springfield, and the specific strange fact of a cartoon family racing home to a couch, as though this is something that matters, from an angle they had not previously considered. The best couch gags defamiliarize. They make the familiar strange for long enough that something true about the strangeness can be glimpsed before the episode begins, and the familiar reasserts itself. The Hertzfeldt gag is the most extreme version of this defamiliarization. But it is not the only version. Every couch gag that works is, in miniature, a version of what the best Simpsons episodes do at full length. Take the familiar and tilt it just far enough that what is normally invisible about it becomes briefly, startlingly visible. Let's spend some time with the geography, because Springfield's location is one of the most beloved surface-level mysteries in the show, and there is more to it than the popular version of the story acknowledges. The common account goes like this. Springfield has no fixed location. The show has placed it in different states at different times. Matt Groening has said it is inspired by Springfield, Oregon, but the show immediately contradicted that. The writers do this deliberately to keep the town universal, to prevent it from being specifically located anywhere so that viewers everywhere can feel like Springfield might be their town. That explanation is accurate as far as it goes, but it leaves out something worth exploring. The geographic impossibility of Springfield is not just a clever production choice. It is an accumulation of specific, deliberate contradictions that the writers have been placing in the show for 36 years, and the pattern of those contradictions tells you something about what kind of place Springfield is supposed to be. Consider the features the show has established for Springfield at various points. It has an ocean coastline. It has a harbor. It has mountains near enough to ski on. It has desert. It has farmland. It has a canyon. It has a gorge. It is close enough to a major city that characters drive there regularly, but far enough away that the major city feels like a separate world. It has weather consistent with a northern climate in winter episodes and weather consistent with a southern climate in summer episodes. It has everything, all at once, none of it consistent with any single American geography. You could argue this is just laziness, that the writers simply chose whatever physical environment a given episode needed without worrying about continuity. But the show has too much institutional memory for that explanation to be fully satisfying. The same writers who remembered a single throwaway line from 3 seasons ago to set up a callback are not the kind of people who forget that they placed Springfield on the coast last week when this week they need it to be landlocked. The geographic contradictions are not accidental, they are policy. And here is the thing about that policy. It has a practical consequence that most discussions of Springfield's location skip over. A town with no fixed location has no fixed regulatory jurisdiction. The Environmental Protection Agency, which appears in the show and even plays a significant plot role in the movie, cannot easily regulate a facility whose location keeps changing state. The state attorney general responsible for investigating the nuclear plant depends on which state Springfield is in on any given day. The legal infrastructure of accountability requires stable geography, and Springfield does not have stable geography. This is funnier than it sounds if you say it out loud. Springfield may have been designed to be geographically ambiguous, specifically because geographic ambiguity is a form of legal immunity. Or possibly the writers just thought it was a good recurring joke, and the legal immunity angle is a coincidence. Both of those things can be true simultaneously, which is something worth keeping in mind as we go deeper. There is one more piece of surface-level information that belongs in this section, and that most discussions of the show handle too briefly to do full justice to. The chalkboard gag, which appears at the opening of most episodes and which has a history and a function that are more interesting than they appear. The chalkboard gag is always the same structure. Bart writes a sentence on a blackboard repeatedly as a punishment. The sentence is always a comic declaration of guilt or commitment to not repeating some specific offense. The gag changes with every episode. The history of the chalkboard lines is that the early ones were written by specific writers who took the assignment seriously as a creative challenge. The constraint is severe. One sentence, punitive framing, comedy inside the punishment. The best chalkboard lines work because they imply an offense that is more interesting than the line that punishes it. I will not instigate revolution. I am not a 32-year-old woman. The pledges suggest incidents that exist off-screen, incidents that the viewer gets to imagine but that the show never provides. The chalkboard gag is a generator of implied stories, a comedy form that produces more than it states. The chalkboard lines have also occasionally been political, in ways that the rest of the episode was not. Lines that addressed real events or real controversies through the oblique form of Bart's punishment. These were opportunities for the show to say something pointed in a format that provided deniability, since Bart is being punished for saying it, which means the show is technically condemning the content while delivering it to the audience. The yellow skin is one of the surface-level facts that almost everyone who watches the show accepts without questioning, and that becomes genuinely strange the moment you apply even mild scrutiny to it. Every Springfield resident who is native to the town is yellow. Not jaundiced-looking yellow, not a pale yellowish color, but a solid, consistent, saturated yellow that matches no human skin tone in nature. The show chose this color, according to production accounts, because it read clearly on television screens of the era and because it distinguished the characters from the white or pink skin tones of most animated characters at the time. This is the practical explanation. It is almost certainly correct. But within the logic of the show's own universe, where Springfield is a real place and these are real people, yellow skin is a mutation. It is not a natural human skin color. The characters who arrive in Springfield from outside the town, the guest stars and one-episode characters who come from the world beyond Springfield, look different. Their proportions are more realistic. And their skin, when depicted in the show's visual language, sometimes has the quality of skin rather than the quality of a cartoon color choice. The difference is subtle, and the show does not emphasize it, but it is there. And the radiation theory uses it as its most fundamental piece of visual evidence. The people who live in Springfield look different from the people who do not, and the difference is consistent with the kind of biological alteration that decades of chronic low-level radiation exposure would produce in a population. The show encoded its darkest theory into its most basic visual design choice. The yellow skin is not just a production decision. Within the world the show built, it is a symptom. The question of who knows this within the show's universe is the question the radiation theory hangs on. Burns knows. The show makes this explicit. His weekly treatments, his understanding of what radiation does to biological systems because he is personally managing its effects in his own body, his pharmaceutical infrastructure capable of synthesizing experimental interventions, All of these establish that Burns is acutely aware of what his plant is doing to the people around him. His awareness and his continued operation of the plant are simultaneous facts, and the combination of those two facts is the moral heart of the show's darkest reading. Nobody else in Springfield appears to know. Or perhaps more accurately, nobody else in Springfield appears to be able to know, because the cognitive impairment produced by the same contamination that produces their yellow skin and their 4 fingers also compromises the specific cognitive functions that would allow them to perceive and analyze their own situation. This is the loop that the radiation theory closes. The cause of the impairment is the impairment. The thing that prevents Springfield's residents from understanding what is happening to them is the same thing that is happening to them. Burns does not need to actively suppress information. The contamination itself does the suppressing. Let us also talk, while we are in this surface layer, about the Simpsons' relationship with other characters who have passed through Springfield from the outside world over the years. The guest star tradition of The Simpsons is one of the most extensive in television history. Hundreds of celebrities, public figures, musicians, athletes, politicians, and cultural personalities have appeared in the show over 36 years, usually playing versions of themselves. The pattern of these appearances is interesting when you look at it across the full run of the show. Early guest appearances tended to be integrated into the episode's story, with the celebrities' presence serving a specific narrative purpose that used their actual public persona to make a specific comic or thematic point. Michael Jackson's appearance in the Season 3 premiere is the most famous example. The episode used Jackson's cultural status to make a specific joke about celebrity, about ordinary life, about the gap between the famous and the anonymous. The guest was a device for saying something. Later guest appearances tend to use celebrities more decoratively, as a form of cultural event in themselves. The celebrity appears, the audience recognizes the celebrity says some version of their public persona, the audience registers the presence. This is not quite comedy in the same sense. It is closer to a form of television event, the sense of something happening, without necessarily producing the feeling of something having been said. This shift tracks something broader about the show's relationship with American celebrity culture over its run. The early show was skeptical of celebrity and used its guest stars to examine that skepticism. The later show has become more celebratory of celebrity, or more precisely has become a form of celebrity itself, a show so famous that appearing on it is itself the content, rather than a vehicle for content. The Simpsons has become the thing it used to make fun of. This is, depending on your disposition, either an interesting irony or a small tragedy. Probably it is both. There is one more recurring element of Springfield's surface that is worth slowing down for before we leave this layer. The music that plays in Moe's Tavern, in the school hallways, in the background of crowd scenes at the stadium or the festival or the town hall meeting. Most viewers process this music as ambient texture, as the show filling audio space in a way that feels vaguely appropriate to the setting. But the musical choices in the Golden Era episodes were deliberate, in ways that reward attention. The show used jazz, blues, country, and classical music in its background, scoring as a way of characterizing the environments its characters inhabited. The specific music playing in a scene is often a commentary on what is happening in that scene, a secondary layer of meaning available to anyone paying attention to the soundtrack. A scene in which Homer is deluding himself about something will often have music that is slightly too cheerful, too confident, playing against the reality the audience can see. A scene in which something genuinely sad is happening under the surface of a comic situation will sometimes have a musical cue that acknowledges the sadness, even while the dialogue maintains the comedy. This is sophisticated storytelling by any standard, the use of multiple simultaneous channels of communication to produce an experience that is richer than any single channel could deliver. And it was done, consistently, in a primetime animated comedy that most viewers were watching while eating dinner or half paying attention to something else. The sophistication was there, whether or not anyone was receiving it. The show made it available and trusted the audience to find it. That trust is one of the defining characteristics of the Golden Era show. It trusted its audience to be smarter than the format required them to be, to pick up more than the minimum the comedy needed in order to function, to be willing to engage with material that was operating on multiple levels simultaneously. And the audience, in sufficient numbers, was exactly that smart. The show found and cultivated the audience it trusted, which is the specific kind of creative relationship that produces the loyalty and sustained engagement that the Iceberg documents. The music of Springfield is part of that trust. It is part of what the show was saying to the people listening carefully, underneath the jokes that kept everyone else entertained. When The Simpsons was in production during its first several seasons, the animation was outsourced to a Korean studio called Klasky Supo. The studio handled the actual drawing and painting of the show based on storyboards and designs created by the American team. This was a common practice in American animation at the time, a cost-saving measure that was industry standard. The first Klasky Supo seasons have a distinctive look. The animation is slightly less fluid than later seasons. The character designs are a little different, a little rougher around the edges. Homer's head has a slightly different shape. The colors are different. The staging and composition of scenes reflects the translation between the American creative team's intentions and the Korean studio's interpretation of those intentions. Fans often describe the early seasons as having a different feel from the later ones, and they usually attribute this to the writing being better, which is accurate, but it is not the only factor. The visual language of the early show is also literally different, produced by different hands working in a different studio with a different set of tools. When the show eventually brought animation production in-house and later transitioned to digital production, the look changed again. Springfield in the 90s looks subtly different from Springfield in the 80s, which looks subtly different from Springfield in the 2000s. What this means is that when fans talk about the show's golden era having a specific quality, a specific warmth and texture that later seasons lost, they are describing something real. That quality is partly the writing and partly the specific visual style of the outsourced animation, which had imperfections that, paradoxically, gave it character. The slight wobbliness of early season animation, the way characters' proportions would shift slightly between scenes, the warm and slightly uneven color palette, all of that contributed to a texture that felt handmade in a way that later, more polished production did not. The show got technically better over the years. Some fans believe it also got aesthetically colder. That tension between technical improvement and the loss of a harder-to-define quality is one of the quiet themes that runs through the entire history of The Simpsons, and we will encounter it again as we go deeper. There is something worth lingering on here before we move to the next layer, because it applies to everything we will discuss tonight. The Simpsons is a show that has always been in the process of becoming something slightly different from what it was. In its earliest seasons, it was becoming the show that would define its golden era. In its middle seasons, it was at its peak and beginning to change. In its later seasons, it has been in a long, complex negotiation with its own history, with what it established and what it can no longer do and what it can still do, and what it owes to the people who loved it at its best. This negotiation is not simple. It is not simply decline. The show at its current stage has found ways to be genuinely good that the early show could not have anticipated, because it is working with 36 years of accumulated mythology and character history and audience relationship that the early show did not have available to draw on. There are things the current show can do that the early show could not do, because the early show had not yet built the foundation that those things require. But the things the early show could do, the specific energy and surprise and freshness of those first 8 or 10 seasons, those things are genuinely not reproducible. They required conditions that no longer exist. And acknowledging this is not a criticism of the current show or the people making it. It is simply a description of what time does to creative work, how the conditions that produce excellence are specific and contingent and cannot be reassembled by intention. Springfield at its inception was a place that felt like it might do anything. Springfield now is a place that we know very well and that knows we know it. Both versions are real. Both have value. And the tension between them is what makes the iceberg as deep as it is. For now, we are leaving the surface behind. The water below is getting darker. When you study the writing staff of The Simpsons during its first decade of production, you encounter something that does not quite have a parallel anywhere else in the history of American television comedy. The show assembled, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, a concentration of raw intellectual talent in a single writer's room that arguably has not been replicated since. The Harvard Lampoon pipeline was real and significant. The Lampoon, Harvard's humor magazine, had been training people for professional comedy careers since the 1970s. Saturday Night Live pulled from it. Late-night television pulled from it. And The Simpsons, at a specific moment in the early 90s, pulled from it more aggressively than anyone else. But the Harvard connection only tells part of the story. What made The Simpsons' writing room unusual was not just the prestigious academic backgrounds of its members. It was the combination of that academic rigor with a genuine love for the full spectrum of American popular culture, high and low simultaneously. The writers who produced the show's golden era were people who could write a joke that worked on the level of a Marx Brothers gag, while also embedding in the same scene a reference to a specific 19th century French novel that maybe 3% of the viewing audience would catch. They were, in other words, exactly the kind of people who would write a show with a surface accessible to everyone and a depth accessible to whoever was willing to dig. The mythology around the writing room has grown considerably in the decades since the show's peak. There are stories about the culture of the room that explain a great deal about why the show produced what it produced, and understanding that culture helps decode some of the choices that puzzled audiences at the time and continue to puzzle people who encounter them now. One of the most significant things about the early writers' room was its relationship to failure. The culture that developed under showrunners like Al Jean and Mike Reiss, and then under Conan O'Brien before he left for late night, and then under David Merkin, was one where a joke that did not land was not just discarded but actively examined. The writers wanted to understand why something failed, not just clear it from the table and move on. This is unusual in television comedy, where the pace of production typically prevents that kind of forensic attention to negative results. The consequence of this approach was a room that got better at comedy through systematic study of its own mistakes. The writers were not just funny people generating material. They were also analysts of comedy, students of the mechanics of why jokes worked and why they did not, and that analytical perspective gave the show a level of technical craft that was invisible to viewers but determined everything they experienced. Conan O'Brien's tenure as a writer on the show is particularly interesting because O'Brien has talked about it at length in various interviews over the years, and his descriptions of the culture illuminate something important about how the show's creative identity was formed. O'Brien arrived at the show after working as a writer at Saturday Night Live, and he has described The Simpsons' writing room as a completely different environment. At SNL, the culture was fast and somewhat chaotic, driven by the weekly deadline and the need to fill a specific number of minutes with material that worked at any cost. At The Simpsons, the pace was different. There was more time, more space for things to develop, and there was a more explicit culture of literary and intellectual ambition, of taking comedy seriously as a craft with a history and a set of standards that the best practitioners held themselves to. O'Brien has described the experience of being in the room when a joke was found, the specific sensation of watching something click into place, as unlike anything he experienced anywhere else in his career. The standard in the room was not just funny, it was right. There was a distinction, meaningful to everyone in the room, between a joke that was merely funny and a joke that was right, that was precisely the correct observation about the thing being observed, rendered in precisely the correct form, with precisely the correct rhythm. A joke that was merely funny could be written quickly and forgotten. A joke that was right was the result of sustained searching, of rejecting almost right versions until the exactly right version emerged. This distinction is one of the key differences between the Golden Era show and what came after. The later seasons produced jokes that were funny. The early seasons produced jokes that were right. Both things produce laughter, but they produce different kinds of laughter, and the difference is felt even if it is not fully articulated by most viewers. George Meyer is the person most often cited, by the other writers who worked with him, as the purest embodiment of the right joke standard. Meyer joined the show in its second season and became one of its most influential presences without ever being a showrunner or a public-facing figure. He worked as a staff writer for most of his tenure, which is unusual given his influence. But his influence was exerted through the quality of what he brought to the room rather than through institutional authority. The specific quality that other writers describe in Meyer's contributions is a willingness to go to uncomfortable places for the sake of accuracy. Meyer, as other writers have described him, was not interested in jokes that made the characters look better than they were, or that softened difficult realities into more palatable forms. He was interested in the exact truth of what a person in a specific situation would actually think and feel and do, even when that truth was dark or embarrassing or unflattering. The jokes he pushed for were often the ones that required everyone in the room to sit with something uncomfortable for long enough to find the comedy in it. This is the quality that makes the Golden Era episodes hold up so well under repeated viewing. The emotional reality underneath the jokes is not approximate or idealized. It is specific and accurate and honest in a way that takes skill and willingness and a certain kind of courage to maintain across hundreds of episodes. Matt Groening's background is also worth examining more closely than the standard biographical summary, because the specifics of his life before The Simpsons explain the specific sensibility of the early show in ways that the general outline does not capture. Groening grew up in Portland, Oregon, in a household shaped by his father's sensibility. Homer Groening, his father and the inspiration for the name Homer Simpson, was a filmmaker and cartoonist, a person who made things and who took the making of things seriously. The household Groening grew up and valued creative work and had a sense of humor about institutions and authority figures, a baseline irreverence toward power that became foundational to the show he would eventually create. Before The Simpsons, Groening created Life in Hell, a comic strip distributed through alternative newspapers that ran for decades. Life in Hell was deeply personal and often genuinely dark, a vehicle for Groening to process his own anxieties about work, relationships, mortality, and existence in ways that the strip's underground distribution allowed and that network television would later constrain. The characters in Life in Hell, particularly the rabbit Binky and his son Bongo, had a quality of sustained sadness underneath the jokes that felt autobiographical in a way that most comic strips do not. When Groening was approached to create animated shorts for The Tracey Ullman Show, the predecessor to the full Simpsons series, he was initially planning to adapt Life in Hell. He changed course at the last moment, concerned about licensing issues, and created the Simpson family instead. The family he created in that meeting drew on many of the same emotional territories that Life in Hell had been exploring. The specifically American working-class anxiety, the family that loves each other in ways that do not always look like love, the system that grinds people down while assuring them that it is working on their behalf. The Simpsons is Life in Hell with a larger canvas and a different format. The emotional DNA is the same. The specific darkness underneath the comedy is the same. What changed is the scale of the audience that came to know it, which changed everything about how that darkness could be deployed. Alf Clausen's music deserves more than a passing mention in any serious discussion of what made the show work, because the score was doing something unusual for television animation in the early seasons, and the loss of it is one of the reasons later seasons feel different, even when the scripts are of comparable quality. Clausen scored the show for 27 seasons, using a live orchestra rather than synthesized music. This was expensive. It was unusual for television, and it created a sonic environment for Springfield that had a warmth and a texturally live quality that synthesized scores simply do not have. The specific way Clausen's scores worked was to treat the emotional content of scenes with operatic seriousness, even when the scenes were primarily comic. A scene that was funny got a score that acknowledged what was funny about it, while also acknowledging what was not funny about it. The music held both registers simultaneously in a way that told the viewer, subliminally, that what they were watching was worth their full attention. When Clausen was let go from the show in 2017, it was described as a cost-cutting measure, and the replacement scores, produced digitally, are technically competent. They do not do what Clausen's scores did. The emotional ambiguity, the willingness to play the sad thing under the funny thing simultaneously, that is largely absent from the digital scores. The show sounds different now. It sounds slightly more like a show that knows it is a cartoon, and slightly less like a show that insists on being taken seriously despite being a cartoon. That insistence was part of what made it extraordinary. O'Brien has also described the specific way the show handled rewrites, which was unlike anything he had encountered before. In most writers' rooms, a scene gets written, gets notes, gets revised, and then moves forward. At The Simpsons, in its peak years, a scene could be torn down and rebuilt multiple times, with different approaches tried and compared, with arguments made about the construction of individual jokes that went on long enough to make the room's less patient members want to climb the walls. The standard being applied was not just whether something was funny, it was whether it was as funny as it could possibly be. This culture is why certain Simpsons jokes are the specific jokes they are, the ones that feel like they arrived fully formed, like they could not have been written any other way. Those jokes exist in that form because someone in a room in Los Angeles spent several hours rejecting every version of that joke that was not exactly right. Now let's talk about Matt Groening himself, because his relationship to the show is more complicated and more interesting than the creator of iconic show narrative suggests. Groening came to The Simpsons from a very different creative tradition. His background was in alternative comics, specifically the underground comic scene that produced artists who were deliberately working outside the mainstream of American commercial entertainment. His comic strip, Life in Hell, which predated The Simpsons by nearly a decade, was drawn in a rough, deliberately crude style and dealt with themes of workplace alienation, relationship dysfunction, and the general misery of modern life in ways that were funny but also genuinely bleak. The transition from Life in Hell to a primetime animated television show for a major network was an enormous cultural shift, and Groening has been candid in various interviews about the tensions that came with it. He wanted the show to have a critical edge. He wanted it to say something about American culture, about the gap between the idealized image of the American family and the reality of what American families actually experienced. He wanted the comedy to have bite. The network wanted a hit. These two goals were not mutually exclusive, but they were not always perfectly aligned either, and the history of Groening's relationship with Fox is a story about two parties who needed each other and occasionally drove each other to distraction. Fox gave Groening and his collaborators unusual creative latitude for a network television show of that era, partly because the network itself was new and hungry and willing to take risks that the established networks would not, and partly because the early success of the show quickly demonstrated that creative risk was profitable. Groening responded to that latitude by putting things in the show that were, for a primetime animated family comedy, genuinely subversive. The show's portrayal of Homer's employer, the nuclear plant as a physical embodiment of corporate indifference to safety and human welfare, was not subtle satire. Burns was not a caricature of villainy in the harmless tradition of cartoon antagonists. He was something more specific and more pointed, a recognizable portrait of a certain kind of American wealth and the moral corruption that, in Groening's view, inevitably accompanied it. The show's portrayal of the media, of government, of organized religion, of law enforcement, all carried the same critical charge. Springfield's institutions did not function well. They were operated by people who were either incompetent, corrupt, or both, and the consequences fell on the ordinary people at the bottom of every hierarchy. This was not the premise of a typical primetime family comedy. It was the premise of a politically engaged piece of satire that happened to also be genuinely funny. Groening has talked about hiding things in the show that he knew would not survive if anyone at the network noticed them. Details that were too pointed, references that were too critical, moments that crossed lines that the Standards and Practices Department would have flagged if they had caught them. The show at its peak had a relationship with its own network that was partly cooperative and partly adversarial, and the tension produced by that relationship was productive in the way that creative tension often is. The show kept reaching for things it was not entirely sure it was allowed to have. There are also specific Groening signatures that appear throughout the early seasons, visual and thematic details that he embedded as a kind of personal statement inside a show that was increasingly a collaborative creation rather than a singular vision. The most famous of these is the way he signed his name into the show's visual design, hiding a stylized version of his initials in various background elements across many episodes. But there are deeper signatures too, thematic obsessions that recur across Groening's work, from Life in Hell through The Simpsons through his later show Futurama. The theme of the workplace as a site of quiet, relentless dehumanization shows up everywhere Groening has ever worked. Homer's relationship with the power plant, the sense of a man trapped in a job that does not suit him, surrounded by colleagues and supervisors who range from indifferent to actively hostile, is a version of a story Groening has been telling since the 1970s. The comedy of workplace misery, the laugh that comes from recognizing in fiction the specific texture of your own professional unhappiness, is something Groening understands deeply and returns to compulsively. The theme of children as the most honest observers of adult dysfunction also runs through everything he does. Lisa's clarity is a Groening constant. The child who sees what the adults refuse to see, who says what the adults will not say, who carries the awareness that everyone else is suppressing, that is a character Groening seems drawn to at some fundamental level. She appears in different forms across his work, but she is always there. Understanding these recurring preoccupations helps explain why the show makes certain choices that might otherwise seem puzzling. The decision to give Lisa a plotline about vegetarianism, for example, which aired in 1995 and was genuinely controversial at the time, was not just a topical choice. It was Groening working one of his consistent themes, the individual conscience in conflict with social conformity, the person who sees something clearly and cannot pretend not to see it, even when everyone around them wants them to look the other way. The episode ended with an unusual statement for a network television comedy. Lisa does not convert back to eating meat at the end. She remains a vegetarian. The episode does not resolve the tension by having the idealistic character abandon her ideals in service of restoring the status quo. This seems like a small thing, but it is a genuine departure from the conventions of episodic television, and it exists because Groening pushed for it. Let's talk about some of the specific production secrets that fall into this layer of the iceberg, the things that production insiders know and fans of the show have traced through archival research and interview material. One of the most interesting production facts about the Golden Era episodes is how the show handled music. The Simpsons has always had an unusually sophisticated musical culture for a television comedy. Alf Clausen, the show's composer from Season 2 through Season 28, was trained as a serious orchestral musician, and he brought that training to the show in ways that are audible if you listen for them. The music in The Simpsons is not just mood-setting background, it is functional in ways that most television music is not. Clausen's scores for individual scenes often contain jokes of their own, musical references and allusions that comment on what is happening on screen in the same way that a verbal joke would. A scene set in a vaguely European context might have music that quotes from a specific 19th century composer in a way that is comedically accurate to that context. A scene involving Homer's self-delusion might have music that mirrors and gently mocks his emotional state. The score is always doing something, and what it is doing is frequently more sophisticated than viewers who are not trained musicians would have any way to notice. Clausen was eventually replaced in 2017 after 27 seasons, a decision that was controversial within the show's fanbase, and that Clausen himself addressed publicly with some bitterness. The change was attributed to budget considerations, and the new approach to the show's music was different enough that fans who paid attention noticed immediately. The shift from live orchestral recording to a more hybrid digital approach changed the texture of the show's sound in ways that, again, most viewers would not consciously identify, but many would feel. The sound design of Springfield is another area that rewards close attention. The specific ambient sounds of the show, the way the power plant hums in the background of scenes set in that environment, the particular quality of the noise at Moe's Tavern, the specific audio texture of the Simpson household, these are all deliberate design choices that were made and maintained with surprising consistency across the show's run. The sound of Springfield is recognizable in the same way the look of Springfield is recognizable. The aesthetic coherence of the show extends into domains that viewers experience without consciously registering. There is also the matter of the voice performances, which have been analyzed extensively and which contain more information than a surface-level listen reveals. Dan Castellaneta's Homer is the obvious starting point because it is one of the most recognized vocal performances in the history of animation and because its development over the years of the show tracks something interesting about how the character evolved. The original Homer, the Homer of the first season, sounds different from the Homer of the Golden Era. The voice is slightly higher and faster, less settled into the character's specific rhythm. Castellaneta was still finding the character, still discovering what specific vocal quality the specific emotional register of Homer required. The performance in Season 1 is very good. The performance in Seasons 3 through 8 is something else entirely, something that is arguably one of the great comedic vocal performances in the medium's history. What changed? Partly it was time. Castellaneta spent years with the character and learned, in the way that long immersion teaches things, what Homer sounded like when he was afraid, when he was overconfident, when he was pretending to understand something he did not understand, when he was experiencing the specific Homer emotion that is somewhere between bafflement and contentment. The vocal differentiation between these states became more precise and more expressive with each passing season until the performance had a richness that the early episodes only gestured toward. The other voice actors in the principal cast went through similar evolutions. Julie Kavner's Marge developed from a slightly generic voice of reason wife into something much more specific and strange, a performance that captures Marge's suppressed frustration through a particular kind of vocal tightness that is funny and sad simultaneously. Nancy Cartwright's Bart found its specific energy early and has maintained it with remarkable consistency. Yeardley Smith's Lisa has evolved in ways that track the character's increasing emotional complexity. These vocal performances are the connective tissue of Springfield. They are what make the characters feel real in a way that goes beyond the writing, beyond the animation, beyond any individual creative decision. When you close your eyes and hear Homer say something, you are not hearing a voice performance. You are hearing a person. That is the kind of magic that takes years to build and that, once built, is almost impossible to replicate. We have a ways still to go in this section, and there is one more category of production information that belongs here before we move on: the things that almost happened. The Simpsons has a long history of storylines that were conceived, developed, sometimes even partially produced, and then abandoned. Some of these are known through DVD commentaries and interviews. Others are known through documents that have made their way into public view over the years. And a few are known through the specific texture of episodes that seem to be building towards something that never arrives. One of the most famous almost happened moments is the show's long relationship with the idea of a major character death in the early seasons. The writers talked seriously on multiple occasions about permanently killing a main character. The names that came up most frequently in these discussions were Marge and Homer, which gives you a sense of how dark the creative territory the show was willing to explore in its peak period. The deaths were never executed, partly because of network pressure, and partly because the writers themselves could not agree on how to do it in a way that served the show, rather than merely shocking the audience. The fact that they discussed it seriously, though, is itself informative. It means the writers in those rooms were thinking about The Simpsons as a show that was capable of that kind of stakes. They were imagining a version of the show where things that happened had permanent consequences, where the fictional world of Springfield was held to a standard closer to the one real life operates by. That version of the show never fully materialized, but its ghost is present in some of the show's most powerful episodes, the ones where the emotional stakes feel genuinely high, because you can sense the writers testing how close they can get to the real thing. The relationship between what the show almost became and what it actually is, between the darker, more consequential version of Springfield that the writers occasionally reached for and the perpetually resetting comedy that the format ultimately required, is one of the central tensions of the show's entire history. We will be visiting that tension many more times before we are done. There is something else about the show's production history that belongs at this layer, and that illuminates why the Golden Era episodes have a specific texture that later episodes do not. The role of the table read in the show's creative process, and what happened to that process as the show evolved. In the Golden Era, table reads were not simply a formality in the production pipeline. They were a genuine creative event, a moment when the material met the cast's voices for the first time, when the collision between what the writers had imagined and what the actors brought to the material produced something that was sometimes better than either the text or the performance could have achieved separately. The cast of The Simpsons in its peak years was one of the most technically accomplished groups of voice performers ever assembled. Dan Castellaneta, Julie Kavner, Nancy Cartwright, Yeardley Smith, Hank Azaria, Harry Shearer. Each of them brought to their characters not just vocal performance but deep institutional knowledge, years of inhabiting these specific people, understanding their rhythms and their contradictions, and the specific places where a delivery could make a line do something the writing alone had not anticipated. Table reads in this environment became creative crucibles. Something in the writing would not quite work, and a specific delivery would fix it. Something that seemed too dark or too strange on the page would land perfectly in the room, and the writers would realize the page had undersold it. The dialogue was not finished until it had been through the voices, and the voices were not simply executing the dialogue, they were completing it. This collaborative completion, the specific creative chemistry between the writers and the cast in the specific environment of a table read where everyone was at full attention and fully invested, is one of the things that is genuinely not reproducible. You can hire excellent voice performers. You can employ excellent writers. You cannot manufacture the specific accumulation of trust and mutual creative familiarity that the original Simpsons cast and writing team built over years of working at that specific intensity on that specific material. The early Simpsons sounds the way it sounds because of what happened in those rooms, between those people, during those table reads. The texture of the performances in the Golden Era episodes carries something that is too subtle to fully describe, but that you hear if you know what to listen for. The sound of people who are genuinely inhabiting something, who have let the characters live inside them long enough that the performance has stopped being performance and started being something closer to revelation. You can hear it in the specific way Castellaneta plays Homer's rare moments of genuine insight, or the way Kavner's Marge sounds when she is at the absolute limit of her patience. You can hear it in Cartwright's Bart in the episodes where Bart is allowed to be genuinely sad rather than transgressive. These are not just good vocal performances. They are the product of a specific creative relationship, built over specific years in specific rooms, that no amount of talent or effort could replicate from scratch. The show at its best was the sum of everything happening in those rooms. And that sum, as the years passed and the rooms changed and the people in them changed and the stakes changed, could not be maintained at the same height. This is not a failure. It is a fact about time, about how creative conditions degrade as circumstances shift, about how the specific magic of a specific moment cannot be preserved or reproduced even by the people who produced it. The early Simpsons was a once-in-a-generation convergence of the right people with the right material at the right moment. It happened. It produced 8 or 9 or 10 seasons of television that will not be matched. And then it continued, which is a different kind of achievement and a different kind of value. Both things exist. Both things are real. The iceberg contains both. Before we leave this production layer entirely, there is something worth saying about the show's relationship with its guest cast that does not often get examined in the right light. The recurring supporting voices, the actors who returned episode after episode to play characters who were not main family members but who became as essential to the texture of Springfield as anyone in the Simpson household, these performers contributed something to the show that is easy to take for granted and very hard to replicate. Harry Shearer alone voiced Ned Flanders, Mr. Burns, Principal Skinner, Smithers, Kent Brockman, Dr. Hibbert, Reverend Lovejoy, and Lenny, among others. The range this required, the ability to fully inhabit such distinct characters inside a single recording session, is extraordinary. Shearer's work on the show represents one of the most sustained and varied vocal performances in the history of animation. Each of his characters is fully realized, distinct in rhythm, distinct in register, distinct in the specific emotional signature that makes them recognizable within a single syllable. Hank Azaria similarly covered an enormous range, from Apu to Mo to Chief Wiggum to Professor Frink. The work required to sustain these performances at full quality across hundreds of episodes across decades is work that operates mostly below the awareness of viewers who simply receive the characters as they have always been, fully formed and apparently effortless. The effort was not effortless. It was immense and sustained and performed by people with extraordinary skill who showed up and delivered, episode after episode, for years that became decades. The characters of Springfield feel real because the people voicing them committed to making them real, not as a one-time creative act but as an ongoing professional discipline maintained across the entire run of the show. When any of these performers left or were replaced, the texture of Springfield changed in ways that were subtle but real. The specific quality of a voice is not a technical specification that can be matched. It is the product of a specific person's body and training and creative intelligence applied to a specific character over a specific span of time. It is, in the deepest sense, unrepeatable. This is one more way in which the early show's specific achievements cannot be reconstructed. They were built by specific people doing specific work at a specific moment, and the moment has passed. What remains is what was made in it. There is a specific experience that longtime Simpsons fans describe when they revisit certain episodes from the show's peak seasons. They watch something they remember as a comedy, something they laughed at when they first saw it, and they find that on the rewatch it is not primarily funny, it is primarily sad. The jokes are still there, and they still work, but underneath them is a layer of genuine grief or longing or fear that the comedy was originally obscuring. This is not an accident of memory or nostalgia. The show was built this way. The Golden Era writers were extremely skilled at constructing emotional experiences that functioned on multiple levels simultaneously, and the emotional level they were most consistent and most sophisticated about was the one they covered most carefully: the darker psychological reality of the Simpson family's lives. Let us start with Homer, because Homer is the character who receives the most attention and whose psychological profile has been most extensively discussed, and there are still things about him that most analyses miss. Homer Simpson's most obvious characteristic is his diminished intelligence. This is established in the first season and maintained throughout the show's run. He is not just uninformed or occasionally foolish in the way that many sitcom protagonists are. He is genuinely cognitively limited. The show has provided multiple canonical explanations for this across different episodes, which creates a continuity problem that is itself interesting. There are too many explanations for Homer's limited intelligence, and each one suggests a different origin story, a different history of how Homer became the person he is. The crayon lodged in his brain since childhood, established in the season 12 episode Homer the Mo, is the most famous. Remove the crayon and Homer's IQ climbs dramatically. He becomes articulate and observant and capable of complex analysis. He sees Springfield clearly for what it is, and finds the clarity unbearable. He has the crayon replaced. But before the crayon explanation, the show offered other accounts. Homer's chronic exposure to radiation at the plant was implied as a contributing factor multiple times. The general environmental contamination of Springfield was suggested as a factor. And Abe Simpson's parenting, which the show depicts as neglectful at best and occasionally actively harmful, was offered as an explanation for Homer's emotional and intellectual limitations in episodes that explored his childhood. What does it mean that there are multiple explanations? The charitable interpretation is that the writers were not tracking continuity carefully and used whatever explanation fit the episode they were writing at the time. That is probably true to some extent, but there is another interpretation that is more interesting. Homer's cognitive limitations are overdetermined. They have so many causes that removing any one of them would not change the outcome. The crayon, the radiation, the environmental contamination, the inadequate parenting. All of these are contributing factors to the same result. And the result is a man whose intelligence was systematically suppressed by the environment he grew up in and has continued to live in throughout his adult life. Viewed this way, Homer's diminished intelligence is not a character trait or a comedy premise. It is a crime, something that was done to him by a combination of circumstances, some negligent and some deliberate, over the course of his entire life. He is not naturally stupid. He is a person who has been made stupid by a world that had reasons to prefer him that way. The episode where Homer's IQ is restored and he chooses to have it suppressed again is usually read as a comedy about the social costs of intelligence in an anti-intellectual environment. That reading is accurate, but there is something else happening in that episode that deserves more attention. When Homer is intelligent, one of the first things he does is write a letter to his co-workers at the power plant, describing the safety hazards he has identified. The hazards are real and dangerous. The co-workers ignore the letter. The safety hazards continue to exist. Homer's intelligence is specifically unable to change the situation that his intelligence identifies as wrong. He can see what is broken, but he cannot fix it. And the experience of seeing clearly without being able to act is apparently worse than not seeing at all. This is a more complex psychological portrait than the comedy premise suggests. Homer is not choosing stupidity because intelligence makes him socially unpopular. He is choosing stupidity because intelligence presents him with a reality he cannot tolerate and cannot change. The stupidity is protective. It is a form of psychological self-preservation deployed by a man who, in a moment of clarity, looked at his life and found it unbearable. That is not funny. That is heartbreaking. And the show knows it is heartbreaking, and it puts the heartbreak right there in the episode, and then it puts a joke in front of it, and most viewers experience the joke and carry away the comedy. Now let's talk about Marge. Marge Simpson is, in some ways, the show's most underanalyzed major character. She receives less individual episode focus than Homer, Bart, or Lisa. Her inner life is less frequently made explicit. She is often functioning as a stabilizing force in other characters' stories rather than having her own. And the surface read of her character, the patient, long-suffering wife and mother who holds the family together through sheer endurance, is accurate but incomplete in ways that become visible when you look at the specific episodes that give her more space. The show has returned repeatedly, across many seasons, to a specific Marge problem. She is suppressing enormous amounts of herself. Her interests, her ambitions, her frustrations, her anger, her desires for a life that is different from the one she has. All of these things exist in Marge, and all of them are in a state of near constant suppression. The episodes that explore this tend to follow a similar structure. Something gives Marge permission to access a part of herself that she normally keeps locked away. She discovers she is talented at something, or she encounters a person who sees her clearly and reflects that back to her, or a crisis forces her into a role she has not previously allowed herself to occupy. And for one episode, Marge gets to be something other than the family's emotional maintenance system. At the end of almost every one of these episodes, she returns to the maintenance role. The talent gets set aside, the relationship ends, the crisis resolves. The expanded Marge contracts back to the domestic Marge, and the family goes on, and next week is a different episode entirely. The cumulative effect of watching all these episodes together is quietly devastating. Marge has had more potential lives than almost any other character on the show. She has been a painter, an entrepreneur, a police officer, a real estate agent, a voice actor, a nuclear plant worker, a bodybuilder, a gambler, a bowler of professional caliber. Each of these has represented a genuine version of Marge, a path her life might have taken, a self she might have become. Each of them was temporary. The show is not unconscious of this. There are episodes, particularly in the earlier seasons, where Marge's suppression is explicitly named as the show's subject. The episode where she seeks therapy and the therapist points out that her primary emotional strategy is to pretend everything is fine when it clearly is not. That episode is not playing her repression for laughs. It is taking it seriously as a problem, as something that is costing her something real. The question the show never fully answers is whether Marge's suppression is purely a sacrifice she makes for her family, or whether it is also something she partly chooses. There are moments where Marge has the opportunity to pursue something for herself and declines it for reasons that do not entirely come down to family obligation. There are moments where she seems to prefer the familiar weight of her domestic role to the uncertain territory of a life where she is primarily herself rather than primarily a wife and mother. This ambiguity is one of the show's most mature pieces of characterization. Marge is not just a victim of her circumstances. She is also a participant in them. Her suppression is both imposed and chosen, both a structural feature of her life and a psychological strategy she has developed and maintained. The show holds both of those things true simultaneously, which is harder to do than it looks. Bart is a different kind of case, but equally interesting. The surface Bart is the rebellious kid, the prankster, the anti-establishment figure who provides comic relief through transgression. He is the character who got on the early 90s cultural moment, who ended up on t-shirts and lunchboxes and became a symbol of a certain irreverent energy that defined a particular moment in American youth culture. The deeper Bart is something else. Bart Simpson is a child who has been failing academically for his entire school career, who has been labeled as a problem student and a behavior case and a lost cause by almost every adult in his educational environment, and who has internalized those labels to a degree that affects everything about how he moves through the world. He is not failing because he is unintelligent. The show has demonstrated multiple times, in episodes that let Bart engage with challenges that interest him, that he has genuine capabilities. He is failing because the educational system he is in is not designed for the kind of mind he has, and because the people responsible for his education have, with a few exceptions, given up on him. The episode that makes this most explicit is probably Bart Gets an F, the premiere of Season 2. Bart has been given one final chance to pass his history test before he is held back a year. He studies genuinely harder than he has ever studied anything. He dreams about the material. He wakes up the morning of the test knowing everything he needs to know. He sits down to take the test. He fails anyway. The failure is not the result of not knowing the material. It is the result of test anxiety, of the accumulated weight of his own self-image as someone who fails tests, of the psychological baggage that has built up around academic performance over years of being told he is not capable. He knows the answers. He cannot access them in the specific context of the test because the context itself has become associated with failure in a way that overwrites his actual knowledge. What follows is one of the most moving sequences the show ever produced. Bart weeps, not comedy crying, but actual grief, the specific grief of someone who tried as hard as they could and it was not enough. The teacher, Mrs. Crabapple, who has never particularly liked Bart and who has written him off many times, sees his distress and is moved by it in a way that surprises her. She gives him extra credit for correctly identifying the historical context of the blizzard that has started outside the window. He passes, barely. The episode is nominally a comedy, there are jokes in it, but the emotional center of it is Bart's discovery that he is capable of genuine effort, and that genuine effort can still result in failure, and the specific quality of that discovery is not something you laugh at. You recognize it. If you have ever tried your hardest at something and come up short, you recognize it. Lisa requires an entirely different approach, because Lisa's darkness is more explicit and has been more widely discussed, but there are still dimensions of her that get overlooked. Lisa Simpson is the character who is most fully herself, who has the most consistent interiority, who is presented most directly and honestly by the show. She is brilliant, she is principled, she is passionate about justice and beauty and truth. She is also, consistently and by her own account, profoundly lonely. The loneliness is structural. Lisa's intelligence and her ethical seriousness put her outside the social world of her peers, who find her exhausting or boring or both. Her family, who love her genuinely, cannot fully reach her because the gap between how she thinks and how they think is too wide to bridge on most days. Her teachers are either threatened by her or indifferent to her. Springfield as a community has essentially no place for what she is. The interesting thing about Lisa's loneliness is that the show does not present it as a problem to be solved. It is not the premise of a character arc that resolves when Lisa finds her tribe, or learns to connect across her differences, or discovers that she was not as alone as she thought. It is a persistent feature of her life that the show documents with surprising fidelity across many episodes and many years. There is an episode, Summer of 4'2", where Lisa attempts to reinvent herself socially by abandoning her intellectual identity and presenting as a more conventionally social kid to a group of children she meets in a beach town where the family is vacationing. It almost works. She makes friends. She feels, perhaps for the first time, the ease of uncomplicated social belonging. Bart, in one of his more genuinely cruel moments, exposes her real self to these new friends. The friends, to the episode's credit, decide they like the real Lisa better than the version she was presenting. The episode ends with Lisa getting something she wanted, but the episode is shot through with the specific melancholy of someone who has had to choose between authenticity and belonging, and the fact that she got both this time does not erase the fact that she has had to make that choice, that the choice was real and the cost of it was real. Lisa is 8 years old. She has been 8 years old for 36 years, and in those 36 years, she has experienced a degree of isolation that the show depicts honestly and completely, and then, at the end of every episode, resets. She goes back to being isolated and brilliant and lonely and 8 years old, and the next episode begins. The darkness of Lisa's situation is not in any single moment. It is in the accumulation. It is in watching someone experience the same pain, the same longing, the same near miss of connection episode after episode after episode, with no resolution and no growth and no end. That is what the floating timeline does to her. It makes her suffering permanent in a way that suffering in real life is not. The last character we will spend time with in this section is Maggie, because Maggie's hidden depths are the ones the show is most secretive about, and the secrecy is itself part of the story. Maggie does not speak. She has not spoken in any meaningful way across 36 years of television, aside from a single word voiced by Elizabeth Taylor in a 1992 episode that was treated as a one-time event and never extended. She communicates through her pacifier, through her eyes, through gesture and expression, and the occasional action that is far too deliberate and far too effective to be the random behavior of a one-year-old. The theory that Maggie's silence is a strategic choice rather than a developmental limitation is supported by a specific pattern of behavior that the show has established across many episodes. Maggie consistently solves problems that adults cannot solve. She consistently perceives things that adults miss. She consistently acts in ways that are far too purposeful, too well calibrated to the situation, to be explained by the impulsive behavior of an infant. But more than her competence, what makes Maggie strange is her observation. She watches. She watches everything. She is in rooms where conversations happen and she is never assumed to be following those conversations. But her subsequent behavior suggests she followed them perfectly. She is in situations where adults reveal things they would not reveal if they thought anyone was paying attention, and Maggie is always paying attention. What is she doing with all of this information? What is she accumulating, and toward what end? The show does not tell you. It gives you glimpses, episodes where Maggie's capabilities are briefly foregrounded and then tucked away again, where the curtain is pulled back just enough to confirm that there is something significant behind it before being closed again. The Longest Daycare, the theatrical short film that earned an Academy Award nomination, is the clearest window into what Maggie actually is. In it, you see the full extent of her cognitive capability deployed in service of a simple mission: protect a caterpillar from a bully. The mission is modest. The intelligence brought to bear on it is not. Maggie in that film is operating on a level that no infant operates on. She is reading the environment, predicting behavior, constructing multi-step plans, and adapting them in real time when circumstances change. She does all of this silently, invisibly, in a setting that no one is monitoring carefully because it is just a daycare center, just a room full of babies. That detail matters. Maggie operates in spaces that people do not monitor closely because they have decided, in advance, that nothing significant is happening in those spaces. She has the most powerful cover available to anyone in Springfield. She is a baby, and babies are not taken seriously. The question of what Maggie will eventually do with her capabilities, when she will choose to act in a way that cannot be dismissed or explained away, remains one of the genuinely unresolved mysteries of the show. She is accumulating something. 36 years of watching and listening and understanding a world that has consistently underestimated her. At some point, that accumulation has to go somewhere. The show just never tells you where. There is something else worth examining about the Simpson family as a unit before we move on from this section. Something that gets at why the show's character work was so much richer than most television comedy produced in the same era. The Simpson family loves each other. This is clear and genuine and never seriously in doubt across the entire run of the show. But the ways in which they love each other are often deeply dysfunctional, and the show is honest about both facts simultaneously without letting either cancel the other. Homer loves Bart but expresses that love through a strangling reflex that is the show's most consistent visual joke and also, if you track it carefully, a portrait of a man who has no language for complicated feelings and so defaults to physical response. When Homer is overwhelmed, his hands go to Bart's throat. This is funny. It is also a representation of a specific kind of parenting failure, the failure of a father who was himself inadequately parented and who never developed the emotional vocabulary to do better, who loves his son with genuine ferocity and cannot translate that love into anything that reliably benefits the person he loves. Marge loves Homer with a patience that is real and that also extracts an enormous price from her. She loves him for qualities that are genuinely there, his warmth and his enthusiasm and the specific completeness of his love for her, while managing, daily, the consequences of qualities she would rather not be managing. Her love is not naive. She knows Homer. She has chosen to stay with Homer with full knowledge of what that choice costs and what it provides. Homer loves Marge with the specific intensity of a man who has always been afraid that the people he loves will leave, and that fear does not disappear as the show continues. It is documented across many episodes as a persistent feature of who Homer is, a man for whom love is always slightly tinged with the terror of its potential absence. And underneath all of this, the children love their parents with the uncomplicated wholeness that children love parents, even when those parents are imperfect and even when the evidence suggests they should know better. Bart's love for Homer is evident in the moments when Homer is actually present for him, actually engaged and enthusiastic and willing to be in Bart's corner against the world. Those moments are specific and well-drawn, and they make everything else in their relationship legible. Lisa's love for her family is expressed most often as a kind of protective anguish, a willingness to work and fight and sacrifice for people whose limitations she understands fully and whose needs she responds to anyway. She loves them knowing what they are. That kind of love is harder than the kind that does not require knowing. This is what the show's best character work adds up to, a portrait of love inside limitation, a family that is doing the best it can with what it has, which is sometimes enough and sometimes not nearly enough, and which is always recognizable to anyone who has ever been inside a family. The recognition is the point. It is why the show hit so hard when it was firing on all cylinders. You were not watching cartoon people. You were watching something you knew. Before we move to the next layer, it is worth pausing on something that is easy to say and easy to miss the full meaning of. The Simpsons was made by people who loved the things they were making fun of. The show is satirical, and satire, by definition, involves critical distance from its subject. But the satire of the golden era Simpsons is the satire of people who understood working-class American life from the inside, not the outside. The writers who created Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa were not slumming in unfamiliar territory. They were drawing on real knowledge of what it meant to grow up in a family where money was tight and aspirations were large, and the gap between those two things was managed through humor, through stubbornness, through love that was genuine even when it was expressed in ways that looked nothing like the television version of love. Groening's specific autobiographical investment in the material is evident across many episodes. The creative team's ability to make the Simpson family feel like a real family rather than a comedy premise derives from the fact that they had access to the emotional reality of that kind of family from somewhere other than imagination. This is one of the things the show lost as it became more successful, and as its writing staff turned over, and as the writers who arrived in the later seasons came from backgrounds less directly connected to the economic and social reality the show was depicting. You cannot fake the specific knowledge that Homer's anxiety about money carries in the early episodes. You can write jokes about it. You cannot produce the exact texture of dread and gallows, humor, and love as resilience that the best early episodes achieve, without having felt some version of it. The love underneath the jokes is real. The show is worth all the analysis the iceberg contains precisely because the love is real, because people who loved their subject made something about it, and love makes things last in ways that craft alone cannot. Television shows leave ghosts. Every series that runs long enough develops storylines that were begun and not finished, character relationships that were established and then quietly discontinued, plot threads that were introduced with apparent purpose and then dropped without resolution. These abandoned elements are rarely discussed because there is nothing satisfying to say about them. They did not go anywhere. They exist as negative space, as the shapes of things that almost were. The Simpsons, because of its extraordinary length and its production history, has more of these ghosts than almost any other show. And some of them are more interesting than the storylines that were actually completed, because the shape of what they were reaching toward is sometimes more provocative than any conclusion could have been. Let us begin with what might be the most interesting abandoned character arc in the show's history. The slow development of Principal Skinner across the first several seasons, and what was clearly intended to happen with that arc before a production decision cut it short. Before the Armin Tamzarian revelation in Season 9, which we will discuss at length later in this video, Skinner had been one of the show's most carefully developed supporting characters. The writers had spent years building a specific portrait, a man whose entire identity was constructed around military service, institutional authority, and the approval of his domineering mother, a man who had been shaped by Vietnam in ways the show was only beginning to explore, a man whose rigidity and apparent conformism was a shell over something more complex and more wounded. The specific texture of Skinner's relationship with his past, with Vietnam, with the version of himself that existed before the war, had been sketched in across multiple episodes in ways that suggested the writers had a more extensive plan. There were references to specific things that had happened to Skinner during his service that were introduced without being fully developed. There were moments where his control cracked and something raw came through, something that did not fit the bureaucrat principal surface identity he presented to the world. What was the plan? Nobody has fully articulated it, and the Tamzarian episode effectively demolished whatever was being built, replacing the complicated backstory the show had been developing with a completely different origin story. Fans who loved early Skinner have always felt that the Tamzarian episode was not just bad television, but an act of erasure, the deliberate destruction of a character who had been carefully built over 7 seasons. What makes this abandonment particularly resonant is that the Skinner story was specifically a story about authenticity versus performance, about the gap between who someone presents themselves to be and who they actually are. That theme is central to The Simpsons as a whole. The show has always been interested in the performance of identity, in the masks people wear to function in social environments that would not accommodate their authentic selves. Skinner's arc, had it been followed through, would have been one of the show's most sustained explorations of that theme. The fact that it was abandoned and then actively negated by the Tamzarian revelation is one of the reasons that particular episode produces such strong reactions. It did not just fail as an episode, it retroactively damaged something that had been well made. Another significant abandoned thread involves the show's treatment of Homer's relationship with work over the first several seasons. In the early seasons, Homer's job at the nuclear power plant was not just a setting, it was a genuine source of the show's dramatic and comedic energy. Homer's work life was explored with specificity, his colleagues were developed, the culture of the plant, its particular institutional personality, was established across multiple episodes in ways that felt like research. More interestingly, the show developed Homer's relationship with Burns in ways that suggested a longer arc was being considered. Burns's inability to remember Homer's name was a recurring gag, But in the early seasons, it was not just a gag. It was a character observation about a specific kind of power, the power that comes from simply not noticing the people below you in a hierarchy. Burns could not remember Homer because Burns did not need to remember Homer. Homer's existence was so far beneath Burns's concern that it did not register as something worth remembering. This specific dynamic, the invisible employee and the indifferent patriarch, was clearly building towards something in the early seasons. There were episodes that pushed on it, that forced Burns into situations where he had to actually engage with Homer as a person, rather than as a vague background element in his operational landscape. Each time this happened, the show hinted at a version of their relationship that went beyond comedy, something genuinely troubling about the specific dynamics of power and invisibility that defined them. That something was never fully delivered. The later seasons took Burns in a more purely cartoonish direction, making him so explicitly villainous that the subtler portrait of institutional power he embodied in the early seasons got replaced by a more entertainment-friendly archetype. He became a fun villain rather than a true indictment of anything. The Sideshow Bob arc deserves its own extended discussion because it is one of the show's most fascinating cases of a storyline that evolved far beyond its original purpose and then, having evolved, raised questions that the show was never able to fully address. Sideshow Bob began as a minor character. He was Krusty the Clown's silent sidekick, a figure who existed to be the straight man in Krusty's circus of chaos. The first time he was given significant screen time was in the Season 1 episode Krusty Gets Busted, where he turned out to have framed Krusty for armed robbery. That episode was intended as a largely self-contained mystery plot, a vehicle for Bart and Lisa to investigate and solve a crime. The writing of Sideshow Bob in that episode, and particularly the casting of Kelsey Grammer in the voice role, created something the writers had not anticipated. A villain who was genuinely more interesting than most of the show's heroes. Bob was educated, articulate, cultured, and genuinely dangerous. He was also, in a specific way that became more apparent as the character was developed, correct? His contempt for popular culture, for the garbage food aesthetic of American entertainment, for the deliberate lowering of cultural standards that Krusty represented, was presented as villainy, but it was also presented as a legitimate position. The show agreed with Sideshow Bob on several points, even as it arranged his defeat. The subsequent Bob episodes pushed on this ambivalence. Each time Bob escaped from prison and came after Bart, the plot was structured as a thriller or a mystery, but the emotional content was something more complicated. Bob was a man whose intelligence and capability vastly exceeded the life available to him. He was a better entertainer than Krusty, a better thinker than almost anyone in Springfield, a better strategist than the police force that kept catching him. His criminality was, in a real sense, the only channel available to him for the kind of grand, meaningful action his intellect demanded. The show made him sympathetic enough that this reading was not just possible but actively invited. There are Bob episodes where he is unambiguously the most compelling thing on screen, where the comedy comes from watching a genuinely impressive person be repeatedly defeated by circumstances that are beneath him. What the show never resolved was the question of whether Bob deserved the life the writers kept denying him. The arc built toward the possibility of redemption, of Bob finding a legitimate channel for his exceptional qualities, of Springfield actually recognizing and making use of what he was. That possibility was gestured at multiple times and never fulfilled. Instead, the show kept returning Bob to the same loop. Escape from prison, plot to kill Bart, get caught, go back to prison. The loop is funny. It is also, if you follow it long enough, a portrait of a specific kind of waste. The waste of exceptional human capability in a world that cannot figure out what to do with it except lock it up. There are other abandoned threads throughout the show's history that are worth noting even briefly, because each one adds to the picture of a show that was always reaching toward more than it completed. The relationship between Chief Wiggum and the institutionalized corruption of Springfield's police department was established early and suggested considerable development that never came. Early Wiggum episodes hint at a Wiggum who knows exactly what he is doing and why, who has made specific compromises with specific, powerful interests in Springfield, who is complicit rather than merely incompetent. Later seasons turned his corruption into pure buffoonery, replacing the knowing participant with a man who is simply too stupid to be effective at his job. The earlier, more knowing Wiggum was more interesting and more honest about what local law enforcement actually is in many American communities. The show's treatment of Fat Tony and the Springfield mob was similarly truncated. Early mob episodes established a Springfield criminal organization that actually functioned, that had relationships with legitimate institutions, that operated the city's informal economy in ways that the formal institutions either enabled or ignored. Later seasons turned Fat Tony into a comedy character, diminishing the portrait of organized crime's integration into ordinary civic life that the early episodes had been building. And there is the matter of Barney Gumble, who is perhaps the show's most visibly abandoned character development project. Barney in early seasons was a specific tragedy, a man of genuine intelligence and evident capability who had been destroyed by alcoholism in ways the show documented with unusual honesty. The show gave Barney moments that established that he had been someone before the drinking took over, that the person visible at Moe's Tavern was a diminished version of a person who had once had a future. In a season 11 episode, Barney gets sober. He gets genuinely sober, not as a one-episode joke but as a sustained plotline. He discovers he has genuine talent as a filmmaker. He makes a short film about his experience with alcoholism that is, within the world of the show, genuinely moving and accomplished. He stands at the edge of a new life. By the next season, he is drinking again. The sobriety arc, which had been developed across several episodes with apparent seriousness, was simply discontinued. Barney went back to being a drunk at Moe's Tavern, and the show never addressed the reversal. This is painful to watch if you have followed the character carefully. Barney's relapse is not explored or explained. It simply happens, or more precisely, it is assumed to have happened between episodes in a way that is never shown or discussed. The Barney who made that film, who found a reason to be sober, who glimpsed the person he might still become, that Barney disappeared and the old Barney returned, and the show moved on. Some fans read this as a realistic depiction of relapse, the way recovery does not always stick, and the way a person can find something worth being sober for and then lose it anyway. That reading is generous and not entirely unwarranted. Others read it as the show retreating from the complexity it had introduced, returning a character to a simpler, more functional comic role, because the more complex version was harder to write and harder to fit into the episodic structure. That reading is also probably accurate. Both things can be true. The reality of how people experience recovery and relapse is genuinely complex, and the show's failure to follow through on Barney's sobriety could be simultaneously realistic in its outcome and institutional in its motivation. The writers may have written the relapse because they knew relapse was statistically likely, and also because the sober Barney was too difficult to sustain in the show's format. Truth and convenience can produce the same result, and the result is what viewers see. What is lost either way is the sustained portrait of a person working through a genuine problem. Television in its episodic format, with its reset between episodes, has always struggled to accommodate stories about slow recovery and incremental progress. The format rewards dramatic events and punishes the gradual. Barney's sobriety was gradual, and the format ate it. Springfield is full of retreats from complexity. The show built something genuinely interesting and then pulled back from over and over. Across 36 years, the retreats are not random or lazy. They follow a pattern. And the pattern, as we will see when we get to deeper layers of this iceberg, tells you something important about what the show is and what it was afraid to become. One more abandoned thread deserves careful treatment before we leave this section. The relationship the show was building between Homer and his workplace, which in the early seasons was genuinely pointed political comedy about labor and capital in post-industrial America, and which eventually became something much softer and less challenging. In the first several seasons, Homer's position at the nuclear power plant was the anchor of a sustained portrait of what it meant to be a working person in an economy that was increasingly indifferent to working people. Homer's job provided health insurance that the family needed. It provided a paycheck that kept the house on Evergreen Terrace. It required him to spend most of his waking hours in a building run by a man who did not know his name, performing tasks that were existentially meaningless and occasionally genuinely dangerous, in exchange for compensation that was adequate but not comfortable. This is not an unusual situation. This is the situation of a significant portion of the American working population, rendered with specificity through the particular details of Homer's particular job. The early episodes that engaged seriously with Homer's work life were engaging with something true about American labor relations, and the comedy they produced was the comedy of recognition rather than the comedy of exaggeration. Burns in these early episodes was not just an arch-villain. He was a specific kind of power. the power that accrues when someone owns the means by which other people survive and exercises that ownership with complete indifference to the moral dimension of the position. Burns could not remember Homer's name, because the name of a specific employee was simply not relevant information to a person in Burns's position. The indifference was not personal, it was structural. The show gradually let this portrait soften. Burns became more cartoonishly villainous, and Homer's relationship with his job became more purely comedic. The economic critique was replaced by the gag, and something real was lost in that replacement. Something the early show had been saying about American working life that the later show was no longer saying. It is worth asking why this happened. The most charitable answer is that the comedy of sustained economic critique is harder to sustain than the comedy of individual eccentricity, and that the writers, under pressure to maintain viewership and to keep the format fresh, found that Burns the eccentric villain was more reliably productive of comedy than Burns the structural indictment. The less charitable answer is that by the middle seasons, the show had become sufficiently successful that the people making it no longer had the same relationship to economic precarity that the characters they were writing were supposed to embody. The gap between the writers' lives and Homer's life had widened, and when that gap widens, the specific honesty of early economic comedy becomes harder to maintain. Both things are probably partly true, and the result is a show that started as a portrait of working-class American life and became something more universal and less specific, more comfortable and less honest about the specific texture of economic limitation. Springfield has a complicated relationship with death. The show is a comedy, and death in comedies functions differently than death in dramas. In a drama, death is an ending, a period that changes everything that comes after it. In a comedy, death is often a punchline, a momentary interruption in the flow of the gag, something that happens and then is stepped over on the way to the next joke. The Simpsons operates somewhere between these two modes, and the tension between them is one of the most revealing things about the show's specific identity as a piece of art. Some deaths in Springfield are played entirely for comedy and have no lasting weight. Hans Moleman, who we will get to in a moment, is the clearest example of this mode. Other deaths are treated with a weight and a seriousness that few animated comedies have ever attempted. And those deaths linger in the show's history in ways that affect how subsequent episodes feel. The death of Maud Flanders is the most significant and most controversial death in the show's history, and it is worth understanding fully what happened and why it matters. Maud Flanders was Ned's wife, the mother of Rod and Todd. She was a recurring character, present in the background of Springfield life across many episodes, a warm and gentle presence who existed primarily to complete the Flanders family portrait. She was not a character the show focused on extensively, but she was consistently present, consistently defined by her combination of religious devotion and genuine warmth. In the episode Alone Again Natura Diddly, which aired in season 11, Maud died. She was struck by T-shirts launched from a promotional cannon at a NASCAR race. Homer, dodging the T-shirts, caused them to hit Maud instead, and she fell from the bleachers to her death. The death was not foreshadowed. It was not the culmination of a long storyline. It happened with a suddenness and a randomness that was, in its own way, realistic in the way the show rarely attempted to be realistic. People die suddenly. People die because they were standing in the wrong place when someone else moved without thinking. The specific shape of Maud's death captured something true about the arbitrary nature of real mortality. The reason Maud died was not creative. It was contractual. Maggie Roswell, the voice actress who played Maud, had a dispute with the show's production over reimbursement for travel expenses she incurred flying from her home in Denver to record in Los Angeles. The dispute was not resolved in a way that satisfied Roswell, and she left the show. The writers, faced with the absence of Maud's voice, decided to kill the character. This origin story for Maud's death has been public knowledge for years, and it has never stopped being uncomfortable. A character who had been part of Springfield's emotional landscape for over a decade was killed. Not because it served the story, but because a contract negotiation failed. The show then built several subsequent episodes around Ned's grief and his eventual recovery, treating Maud's death as a genuine dramatic event, a weight in Ned's life with lasting consequences. It is both things simultaneously. A death that happened for the worst possible reasons, out of a backstage conflict with no artistic justification, and a death that the writers then treated with remarkable seriousness and emotional care. The grief the show gave Ned in the aftermath of Maud's death is some of the most honest depiction of bereavement in the show's history. Ned's disorientation, his anger, his attempt to date again, and the specific awkwardness of that attempt, these were handled with a gentleness and specificity that felt genuine. The disconnect between the undignified reason for Maud's death and the dignified way her death was subsequently handled is one of the more uncomfortable pieces of information on this iceberg. It reveals something about how television production actually works, about the gap between the human stories being told on screen and the very unhuman institutional machinery producing them. Let's talk about Frank Grimes, because his single episode is one of the most discussed, most analyzed, and most beloved in the show's history, and he represents something about Springfield that cannot be arrived at through any other character. Frank Grimes appears in one episode, Season 8's Homer's Enemy, and he does not survive it. He is introduced as a new employee at the nuclear plant, a man who has built his career entirely through hard work and capability in the face of extremely difficult circumstances. He grew up in poverty. He educated himself. He advanced through the meritocratic system by being genuinely good at his job and genuinely committed to the values that the meritocratic system says should be rewarded. He arrives at the plant and discovers Homer. The episode is structured around Frank's progressive disbelief that Homer's life is possible. Homer is incompetent, negligent, frequently dangerous, and has somehow accumulated a life that Frank, who has done everything right, does not have. Homer has a house. Homer has a family who loves him. Homer has gone to space. Homer won a Grammy. Homer has been president of his local union. Homer has done all of these things, none of them through effort or merit, and the system that was supposed to reward Frank's effort and merit has given Frank very little in comparison. Frank's reaction to this is the reaction of a person whose fundamental worldview is being disproven in real time. He cannot process it. He cannot integrate the evidence of Homer's inexplicably good life with the beliefs that have sustained him through a difficult existence. The cognitive dissonance builds until he snaps, and his snapping is a kind of madness induced by reality failing to conform to the rules he was told it operated by. He dies electrocuting himself during a breakdown, performing Homer's incompetence to demonstrate its absurdity to an audience that does not find it absurd. The episode is devastating precisely because Frank is right. Homer's life should not be possible by the rules Frank was taught. The accumulation of Homer's career history, his safety record at the plant, his documented disasters across years of employment, his survival of situations that would have ended any ordinary career and most ordinary lives, should have produced a very different life. The fact that it has not is not evidence that Homer is lucky in some neutral sense. It is evidence that Springfield's system does not function on the principles Frank was sold. Frank represents something rare in the show, a perspective that has not been shaped by Springfield's normalization processes. He is an outsider, someone who arrived in Springfield without having spent years gradually accommodating himself to its specific reality, and his outsider perspective allows him to see what Springfield's residents cannot see, which is that nothing here makes any sense if you apply normal rules to it. The fact that this clarity kills him is the show's darkest joke. Springfield cannot accommodate people who see it accurately. The accommodation failure is fatal, and the show depicts Frank's death not as a tragedy from Springfield's perspective, but as a comedy, which is itself the harshest possible comment on what Springfield is and how it works. The episode has a specific ending that many analyses skip over. Homer weeps briefly at Frank's grave and then notices an ant carrying a piece of food and is immediately and completely distracted by the ant. His grief for the man who died, partly as a consequence of his own existence, lasts approximately 15 seconds. Then the ant is more interesting. Springfield moves on from Frank Grimes with the same effortless amnesia it applies to everything that should require reckoning. Frank Grimes existed for one episode. He saw Springfield clearly. He died. The show continued as though he had never been there. That is the most Springfield thing imaginable. And in a specific way, Frank Grimes is the stand-in for every viewer who has ever watched the show and thought, none of this makes any sense. Springfield's response to that observation is the same as its response to Frank. It looks at you with genuine incomprehension, and then the ant with the food comes along, and everyone moves on. Homer's life should not be possible by the rules Frank was taught. The accumulation of Homer's career history, his safety record, his history of disasters and recoveries, should have resulted in a very different life. The fact that it has not is not evidence that Homer is lucky. It is evidence that Springfield's system does not function on the principles Frank was sold. Frank Grimes is the character who sees Springfield without the accommodation that its residents have built up. He arrives without having acclimated to the reality of how the place actually works, and the reality kills him. He is in many ways the show's most honest character precisely because he is an outsider, because he has not had years to normalize what is in front of him. The writers of that episode have said in interviews that it was intended as a commentary on the show itself, on the absurdity of Homer's existence as the protagonist of a comedy series, and on the cognitive dissonance that would be produced in a realistic person who encountered that existence. Frank Grimes is, in a sense, the audience member who wanders into Springfield and refuses to accept its terms. He does not survive the encounter. Springfield does not forgive realism. Dr. Nick Riviera deserves a moment here because his character, played primarily for comedy across many episodes, accumulates a kind of horror if you consider what he actually represents in the context of Springfield's medical establishment. Dr. Nick is an incompetent physician who has retained his medical license despite a history of malpractice that would have ended the career of any doctor operating in a functional system. His catchphrase, "Hi everybody," and the "Hi Dr. Nick" response it elicits, is one of the show's most recognized running gags. His incompetence is a reliable source of comedy across many episodes and many years. But Dr. Nick practices medicine in Springfield. He operates on the people of Springfield. He is one of the primary medical practitioners available to a population that has been, as we have discussed, subjected to decades of environmental contamination. These are people who need actual medical care, and one of the people providing that care is someone who is demonstrably not capable of providing it safely. The comedy of Dr. Nick's incompetence depends on the viewer's implicit assumption that the consequences of that incompetence are contained within the episode, that Springfield's residents somehow escape the actual effects of receiving bad medical care from an unqualified practitioner. But the show gives you enough information, across enough episodes, to build a picture of what Dr. Nick's medical practice actually means for the people of Springfield. It means that the population of a contaminated town, people who almost certainly have higher rates of radiation-related illness than the national average, people who have been drinking compromised water and breathing compromised air for decades, are receiving their health care from someone who belongs in prison rather than in a clinic. This is not the premise of a comedy, it is the premise of a public health catastrophe. The comedy comes from looking away from what the premise actually implies. And The Simpsons is very skilled at getting you to look away, at pointing your attention at the joke while something genuinely alarming sits just outside your field of vision. Hans Moleman is, as mentioned earlier, the most frequently killed character in the history of American animation. His death count, calculated by fans who have cataloged his appearances across all canonical episodes, runs to dozens of on-screen deaths in regular episodes, not counting the Treehouse of Horror specials and other non-canonical material. The easy reading is that this is a recurring gag, a dark comedy callback to a specific type of absurdist humor that the show employs. And it is that. But consider what Moleman's repeated canonical deaths mean within the show's established universe. Characters in Springfield know who Hans Moleman is. They have seen him around town for decades. They have, statistically, witnessed several of his deaths. Because he tends to die in public, in front of witnesses, in circumstances that would normally prompt emergency services and investigations, and at least some acknowledgement that something unusual has happened. Nobody investigates. Nobody asks questions. Nobody appears concerned. This is, on one level, the comedy. The joke is the lack of reaction, the perfect social indifference to an event that should produce significant social response. But the lack of reaction to Moleman's deaths is structurally identical to Springfield's lack of reaction to all of its other inexplicable events. Nobody investigates the three-eyed fish. Nobody asks questions about Burns's green glow. Nobody appears concerned about the 342 safety violations at the nuclear plant. The social machinery of Springfield produces the same response to Moleman dying as it produces to anything else that should prompt attention and does not. Moleman is therefore, in his way, a small-scale test of Springfield's capacity for collective denial, and Springfield passes that test every single time. He dies. Nobody notices. Somehow he is back. The cycle repeats. The fact that Moleman's age, as established in one canonical episode, is 31 years old, is the detail that makes everything about him genuinely strange. Whatever happened to Mulman to produce the man visible in the show? The elderly, frail, nearly blind man who exists primarily to suffer. It happened quickly. Something aged him at a catastrophically accelerated rate. Something also made him capable of coming back from deaths that should be final. These two facts together suggest a biology that has been profoundly altered, in some ways made more vulnerable, and in other ways made nearly indestructible. The radiation theory, as applied to Mulman, produces a specific and unsettling portrait. A man who was exposed to something early in his life that aged him rapidly, while simultaneously creating a kind of cellular resilience that allows him to recover from fatal injury. He is the most visibly mutated person in Springfield and the one nobody ever stops to examine. That is, in its way, the most Springfield thing imaginable. One final death deserves mention in this section. Not because it was dramatic or narrative-changing, but because of what it reveals about how the show handles consequences across decades. Dr. Marvin Monroe, the therapist who appears prominently in the early seasons counseling the Simpson family, simply disappeared from the show after season 5. For years, he was gone without explanation. Then, in a later season, it was acknowledged that he had died, with a brief gag that treated his death as a throwaway and moved on. The joke was that the show had forgotten about him and needed to explain his absence. The dark reading is that this is what happens to the people of Springfield who try to help. The therapist who attempted to treat the family's dysfunction, who took their problems seriously and tried to address them through professional practice, was quietly erased. He ceased to exist in the story because his function, genuinely helping the family improve, was incompatible with the show's fundamental structure. The show cannot allow its characters to actually improve. Improvement would mean change, and change would mean the floating timeline cracks, and the floating timeline cracking would mean the dream ending. So the people who threaten improvement get written out, forgotten, acknowledged only in death jokes that underscore their irrelevance. Dr. Monroe tried to help. He died, eventually. In a footnote, Homer is still strangling Bart. The therapist's work accomplished nothing permanent in a town where nothing permanent is allowed. Every community has a mythology, a set of stories and beliefs and practices that define what the community is, that give its members a shared understanding of their place in the world, that answer the questions a community needs answered to cohere and persist. Springfield, over 36 years of episodes, has developed a mythology that is surprisingly dense and surprisingly coherent, built from the accumulated weight of its recurring symbols, its hidden patterns, and its relationship with forces that operate beyond the ordinary. The most explicit version of this mythology is the Stonecutters. The Stonecutters appear in the season 6 episode Homer the Great, and they are the show's version of a secret society, a fraternal organization that controls virtually every important institution in Springfield, by implication, in the world beyond Springfield's borders. The episode is a comedy, structured around Homer's discovery of the Stonecutters' existence and his subsequent joining, elevation to leadership, and eventual expulsion from the group. But the details the episode establishes about the Stonecutters are not entirely comedic. The song they sing to describe their influence includes a specific and comprehensive list of the things they control: the schedule of the traffic lights, the composition of the Major League Baseball, the length of the metric system's basic unit, the placement of the dolmen stones at Stonehenge, the decision about whether Rodney Dangerfield gets respect. These are presented as jokes, and they are funny. They are also a reasonably accurate description of the way real fraternal organizations have historically operated in American civic life. The Masons, the Elks, the Rotary Club, these organizations provided their members with informal networks of professional connection and mutual assistance that operated underneath the formal institutions of governance and commerce. The joke version of this in The Simpsons is more cartoonishly comprehensive than the real thing, but the underlying premise, that informal networks of connected men shape institutions in ways that outsiders cannot see, is not fictional. The Stonecutters episode is funny precisely because it is an accurate caricature, and accurate caricatures contain truths that straight descriptions do not. The specific things the Stonecutters are revealed to control in Springfield matter because they help explain some of the show's long-standing continuity puzzles. Why does Springfield's infrastructure persist in a state of obvious dysfunction without anyone being able to fix it? Because the Stonecutters, who control the relevant systems, have decided that the dysfunction is preferable to the alternative, or simply have not gotten around to addressing it. Why do some characters in Springfield face no consequences for behavior that should produce significant consequences? Because they are, presumably, stonecutters, or have relationships with stonecutters that protect them. The stonecutters' influence also explains something about Burns that other theories only partially account for. Burns is, obviously, a stonecutter. His wealth, his age, his network of institutional connections all mark him as someone at the top of exactly the kind of informal power structure the stonecutters represent. But the episode also establishes that the stonecutters are not monolithic, that they have internal disagreements and hierarchies, and that even within the organization there are people whose power exceeds others. Burns at the top of the stonecutters is Burns with his power amplified and formalized. The pollution of Springfield's water, the corruption of its medical establishment, the rigging of its electoral outcomes, all of this becomes not just the work of one powerful individual, but the work of an entire institutional network that has agreed, collectively and informally, that Burns's priorities are worth protecting. The show's treatment of religion more broadly is worth exploring here because it is more nuanced than it first appears. Springfield is a deeply religious community. The First Church of Springfield plays a significant role in many episodes. Reverend Lovejoy is a recurring character. Ned Flanders' evangelical Christianity is one of the show's most sustained and carefully drawn character studies. And God himself appears in the show, has conversations with Homer, and is treated as a real and present being within the show's cosmology rather than a matter of faith or interpretation. This matters. The Simpsons does not treat religion as a metaphor or as a social phenomenon. Within the logic of the show's universe, God exists. God has a specific appearance he has rendered in the show's animation style, but notably has 5 fingers rather than the 4-finger design of Springfield's residents. God talks to Homer. God has a specific personality, somewhat impatient, occasionally petty, possessed of a sense of humor that runs toward the ironic. The specificity of this depiction is interesting. By making God a real character with real conversations, the show creates a set of theological implications that it then largely does not follow through on. If God exists and talks to Homer, why does God not intervene in the ongoing poisoning of Springfield? If God exists and is apparently capable of involvement in human affairs, why does Ned Flanders, who has dedicated his entire life to faith, get so comprehensively ignored and punished? These are questions the show raises through its own world-building and never answers. They are not the kind of questions a show like this is equipped to answer, but they are genuinely interesting theological questions, and the fact that they arise at all from a primetime animated comedy is evidence of how seriously the show took its own fictional universe in its peak years. The relationship between religion and power in Springfield is also worth examining. The First Church of Springfield is an institution, and like all of Springfield's institutions, it does not function purely as advertised. Reverend Lovejoy's faith is depicted across multiple episodes as genuine but complicated, as something that has worn thin under the demands of actually pastoring a community of people who require more than he can give. His cynicism, which emerges in various episodes, is not the cynicism of a fraud but the cynicism of a believer who has been exhausted by the gap between what faith promises and what it delivers. There is also the matter of the show's recurring numbers and patterns, which have been documented obsessively by fan communities, and which constitute a second layer of symbolic meaning embedded in the visual and structural texture of the show. The number 742, for example, appears throughout the show in various contexts. The address of the Simpson family is 742 Evergreen Terrace. The number appears in other contexts in ways that seem deliberate. Fans have cataloged its appearances and have developed various theories about its significance, ranging from the practical, it was a production code that got embedded in the show's visual design and then kept reappearing because the art department used template elements, to the more mystical it represents. Something intentionally significant that the writers embedded as an inside reference for the attentive viewer? The truth is probably the former, but the latter is more interesting to think about. The idea that a specific number, recurring across 36 years of episodes in various visual contexts, might mean something beyond its practical origin is the kind of pattern that rewards attention without ever quite resolving into clarity. It is typical of the iceberg's deeper layers, things that look meaningful, that might be meaningful, that the show either intended as meaningful or that became meaningful through the accumulation of appearances across decades of consistent use. The show's relationship with death and the afterlife goes beyond God's appearances and deserves its own treatment. The Treehouse of Horror specials, which are the show's annual Halloween anthology episodes, operate outside the show's canonical continuity. They are explicitly non-canonical. The characters die in them regularly and return alive the following week, because these episodes are understood by both the show and the audience to exist in a separate space from the regular Springfield. But the Treehouse of Horror episodes are also where the show explores its darkest material most directly, and what they reveal about Springfield's implicit mythology is significant. The Springfield of the Treehouse of Horror episodes is not entirely different from the regular Springfield. The same characters, the same relationships, the same institutional structures. The difference is that in the horror episodes, the things that are implied in the regular show are made explicit. The power plant's ability to create monsters is no longer metaphorical. The government's capacity for violence against its citizens is rendered literally. The corruption of Springfield's institutions extends to the supernatural as well as the mundane. What this means is that the Treehouse of Horror episodes function as a kind of pressure release, a space where the show can acknowledge the horror implicit in its regular universe without having to carry that horror into the episodes where it would change the nature of the show permanently. The horror is real in the Halloween episodes and then safely contained there, unable to migrate back into the regular timeline. But the accumulation of Treehouse of Horror episodes over 36 seasons creates its own kind of mythology. The Springfield of those episodes has been invaded by aliens, overrun by zombies, haunted by ghosts, subjected to supernatural curses, visited by demons, reshaped by nightmares. The full catalog of its supernatural history is extensive, and the fact that it is all non-canonical does not prevent it from contributing to a portrait of Springfield as a place where something is cosmically wrong. The regular show tells you Springfield is contaminated and corrupted and populated by people who are being slowly destroyed by systems they cannot see clearly. The Halloween episodes tell you that Springfield is also a site of genuine supernatural malevolence, a place that attracts the wrong kind of attention from forces that operate beyond the human. Together, the two Springfields suggest a town that is wrong in ways that go deeper than any single theory can fully account for. There is one more piece of Springfield's mythology that belongs in this section: the show's treatment of memory and forgetting as near supernatural forces. Springfield forgets. This is the show's most documented characteristic. Events that should permanently alter the town happen and are erased. Characters experience things that should change them and return to baseline. The reset between episodes is so thorough that it functions less like a production convenience and more like a physical law of Springfield's universe. The mythology the show has built around this forgetting is subtle but consistent. Springfield does not forget randomly or accidentally. It forgets selectively, precisely, in ways that protect the status quo. The things that get forgotten are always the things that would require significant changes to how Springfield operates if they were remembered. The things that persist are the things that serve the current order. This selective forgetting looks, in aggregate, like something with agency, like something that is choosing what to preserve and what to erase, like a mythology of collective consciousness operating in service of a specific set of interests. Whether that consciousness belongs to Burns, or to the stonecutters, or to the accumulated damage of radiation-induced cognitive impairment, or to the dreaming mind of a man in a coma, or to all of these simultaneously, is left for the viewer to determine. What is not left for the viewer to determine is that the forgetting is real and that it serves someone. There is one more element of Springfield's mythology that the iceberg demands be examined carefully: the show's treatment of superstition and folk belief, which runs parallel to the more organized, religious, and institutional structures, and reveals something different about how Springfield's residents relate to forces beyond their control. Springfield is a deeply superstitious town, in ways that the show depicts with more subtlety than its treatment of organized religion. Superstition in Springfield is not distinguished cleanly from practical reality. When characters behave as though the universe operates on magical rather than rational principles, the show frequently confirms rather than refutes this. Luck is real in Springfield. Curses are real. The specific moral structure of a folk universe, where bad behavior produces bad outcomes through mechanisms that operate outside ordinary causality, appears to function in Springfield in ways that it does not in the real world. This matters because it suggests a specific kind of psychological accommodation that the residents of Springfield have made to their situation. In a town where the official explanations for why things happen are systematically inadequate, where institutional authority cannot be trusted to tell you the truth about the sources of harm in your environment, folk causality fills the explanatory gap. Things happen because the universe is responding to behavior, because luck has shifted, because something in the local mythology has been disturbed. These explanations are wrong, in the sense that the actual causes are material and identifiable. But they are functional, in the sense that they give people a framework for making sense of events that would otherwise be inexplicable. The town's relationship with the recurring Halloween mythology also reveals something specific. The Treehouse of Horror episodes are not canonical, but they are not random either. The monsters and horrors they depict, the parodies of specific horror films and science fiction narratives, the specific fears they externalize, these are the fears of Springfield rendered in fantastic form. They are what Springfield is afraid of when it allows itself, in the special non-canonical space of the Halloween episodes, to be afraid of something. What Springfield is afraid of, when you catalog the Treehouse episodes, is a specific set of things. Losing control of one's own mind and body, being consumed by forces larger than the individual self, the failure of the domestic space to be safe, the dissolution of the boundary between inside and outside that the family home is supposed to maintain. These are the fears of people who are, in some way, already experiencing versions of these things in a form the regular show will not acknowledge directly. The horror episodes are the pressure valve, the space where Springfield can briefly scream about what it is already living through. The fact that these episodes are not canonical, that they exist outside the main continuity, is also significant. Springfield cannot acknowledge its own horror in the space of the regular show. The horror must be quarantined, labeled as a special episode, safely bracketed as a seasonal entertainment. Because if the horror were allowed into the canonical space, it would change what the show was. It would turn the comedy into something else, and that something else would be unbearable to maintain for 36 years. The Treehouse of Horror specials are where Springfield keeps its nightmares. The regular episodes are where it keeps its dreams. There is one more piece of Springfield's ritual mythology that belongs in this section before we descend further. The show's treatment of ceremony and commemoration, the events that Springfield organizes to mark occasions, and what these events reveal about a community's relationship with meaning-making. Springfield holds parades, it holds festivals, it holds the Springfield Film Festival, the Springfield Marathon, the Chili Cook-Off, the Harvest Festival, the 4th of July celebration, the Christmas tree lighting. It holds events with the frequency and apparent sincerity of a community that genuinely believes in the social function of shared ceremony, in the idea that gathering together to mark occasions is something that matters. And in almost every instance, the ceremony fails. The parade gets disrupted. The festival becomes a crisis. The competition devolves into ego and conflict. The Christmas celebration produces more anxiety than joy. The Harvest Festival turns into something nobody planned for. This is partly the comedy premise of many individual episodes. Take a social event that is supposed to go smoothly and introduce the specific friction that makes it go wrong. But the pattern across 36 years is consistent enough to suggest something more than a recurring plot device. Springfield's ceremonies fail because Springfield's community bonds are not strong enough to hold the ceremonies up. The shared meaning that a community ceremony requires is not actually shared, it is performed. The performance holds together in the planning stage and collapses when actual human beings with actual competing needs and histories and resentments are required to execute it. The specific way Springfield's ceremonies fail is also revealing. They do not fail because of external interference or natural disaster. They fail because of the specific fractures that run through the community. The class tensions that put Homer and Burns in the same town with nothing genuinely in common, the institutional failures that put Chief Wiggum in charge of crowd control, the psychological pressures that make Marge's attempt to organize a perfect community event into a source of anxiety rather than joy, the general dysfunction that is Springfield's baseline condition, expressing itself through the specific demands of a public occasion. The ceremonies reveal what the ordinary rhythms of Springfield life conceal, that this community is not actually cohesive. It is proximate. People live near each other. They share infrastructure and institutions and a collective memory of disasters that they have agreed not to discuss. But the deeper bonds that allow communities to function, the shared values and genuine mutual investment and accumulated trust, these are thinner in Springfield than the surface suggests. This is why the stonecutters matter so much as a social institution. They provide, for their members, the genuine community bonds that Springfield's official public life cannot provide. The ceremony inside the lodge is sincere in a way that the ceremony outside it is not. The stonecutters genuinely know each other, genuinely cooperate, genuinely share a collective identity. This is exactly the opposite of Springfield's public life, which performs community without achieving it. The mythology of Springfield is therefore a mythology of compensation. The town creates symbolic structures, ceremonies and rituals, and shared references to fill the space that genuine community bonds do not fill. The symbols are elaborate and sometimes beautiful. The reality underneath them is lonelier than the symbols suggest. And there is something about Ned Flanders and his relationship to Springfield's religious mythology that deserves one more look before this section closes. Ned is the town's most devout resident, the person whose faith is most visible and most consistently practiced. He is also, by a significant margin, the person who suffers most consistently and most severely, without any apparent connection between his suffering and any fault of his own. His wife died because Homer was dodging t-shirts. His house was destroyed by a hurricane. His children grew up fatherless. His patience is exploited repeatedly by the neighbor who destroyed most of what mattered to him. And through all of it, Ned continues to practice his faith. He continues to attend church, to pray, to interpret his experiences through a theological framework that requires him to find meaning and purpose in outcomes that, viewed without that framework, look like senseless punishment of a decent person by an indifferent universe. The show is doing something specific with Ned's faith that is more interesting than simple criticism of religious belief. It is showing you faith under sustained pressure. It is showing you what a genuine belief system looks like when the evidence it is applied to is consistently hostile to its conclusions, when the person holding the belief must work harder and harder to maintain it because the world keeps failing to behave the way the belief says it should. Ned's faith is not naive. It is heroic in the specific and difficult sense of being maintained in the face of evidence that argues against it. Whether you find that heroic or tragic depends on your own relationship to faith. The show, to its credit, does not decide for you. It presents the evidence and the response and lets you determine what you think about the relationship between them. What the show clearly believes, though, is that Ned's faith costs him something real, and that what it costs him is never fully refunded. He gives and gives and gives to his God and to his community and to his neighbor, and he receives in return a kind of peace that the show depicts honestly as genuine but also as insufficient, as a response to suffering that manages the suffering without resolving it. Ned Flanders is Springfield's most religious citizen, and its most tragic one. The two facts are not unrelated. Charles Montgomery Burns has been alive, in one form or another, since the 19th century. This is not a fan theory. It is established in the show's canonical timeline across multiple episodes that place his birth in the late 1800s and his conscious memory across events spanning more than 100 years. He went to Yale. He served in World War II, in a capacity the show describes as morally ambiguous even by the standards of a conflict with a fairly clear moral architecture. He has met historical figures who died before most of the show's audience was born and describes those encounters in the tone of someone discussing last Tuesday. He is, by any reasonable calculation, somewhere between 130 and 150 years old. And he runs a company. He makes decisions. He strategizes. He orchestrates. He maintains, across what should be an impossible span of time, the kind of focused, patient, ruthless intelligence that most people cannot sustain for a decade of active professional life, let alone a century and a half. How? The show's direct answer involves his weekly radiation treatments, which we have already discussed. But the radiation treatments are themselves only part of the answer, because the treatments manage Burns's existing conditions. They do not, in themselves, explain why his mind remains sharp when most of the people around him in Springfield are cognitively diminished by the same environment. The broader answer requires understanding how Burns's empire actually functions, how the systems he has built interlock and reinforce each other, how the power he holds is not just economic but structural in ways that go deeper than money. Let us start with what Burns actually controls. The nuclear power plant is the obvious starting point, but it is also the most visible part of Burns's power, which means it is the part that gets scrutinized while the rest operates undisturbed. The plant supplies Springfield's electricity, which means Burns controls the energy supply of an entire town. This is not just economic leverage. Energy dependence creates a specific kind of vulnerability. A town that gets its electricity from one source, operated by one owner, is a town that can be controlled through its infrastructure in ways that are extremely difficult to resist. Burns has demonstrated willingness to use this leverage. The episode where he blocks out the sun literally uses a giant mechanical device to prevent sunlight from reaching Springfield is the most explicit demonstration of how he thinks about his energy monopoly. He was not trying to destroy Springfield. He was trying to force Springfield to be more dependent on his electricity. The blocked sun was a strategy to increase demand. The residents suffering without sunlight was an externality he had explicitly calculated and found acceptable. That is not the behavior of a cartoon villain. That is the behavior of a monopolist, and it describes a pattern that is recognizable in the real history of American corporate power. The calculation that the suffering of people who depend on your product is an acceptable price for increased market control is not a fictional idea. Beyond energy, Burns controls the show's medical infrastructure in ways that are more subtle but more far-reaching. His pharmaceutical and medical research capabilities, established across various episodes, mean that the treatments and interventions available in Springfield are filtered through his interests. Doctors in Springfield, several of whom are depicted as having relationships with the plant, are operating in a medical environment that Burns shapes. The conditions under which they practice, the resources available to them, the institutional pressures they operate under, all of these are influenced by the largest employer and economic entity in town. Consider what this means for the population's awareness of radiation-related illness. A doctor who identifies a cluster of health problems consistent with environmental contamination and who works in a hospital that depends on Burns's goodwill for its funding is a doctor operating under significant pressure to find a different explanation for what they are seeing. The medical establishment's ability to document and report the specific harms that Burns's plant produces is compromised by the medical establishment's dependence on Burns's continued operation. This creates a closed loop. Burns produces harm. Burns influences the institutions that would document harm. The documentation of harm, therefore, either does not happen or happens in forms that cannot easily be acted upon. The harm continues. This loop is not unique to Springfield. It describes with uncomfortable accuracy how certain real-world industrial communities have operated historically, communities where the largest employer also influenced the local medical establishment, the local government, the local media, and the local judiciary, in ways that made effective oversight of the employer's practices nearly impossible. The show is depicting something real, in cartoon form, with cartoon exaggeration, but the structure it is depicting is real. Burns's control of Springfield's political institutions is established explicitly across many episodes. He has bought elections, he has intimidated candidates, he has had legislation written to serve his interests, and opposed legislation that would constrain them. The Springfield political system, which ranges from Mayor Quimby down through various city officials, functions primarily as a tool for maintaining the conditions under which Burns can operate. Mayor Quimby himself is one of the show's most interesting supporting characters precisely because he is so completely a Burns creation. Quimby's corruption is not incidental, it is structural. He is a politician who has learned to survive in a political environment dominated by a single concentrated source of power and money, and his survival strategy has been to become as useful to that source as possible. He does not resist Burns because resistance would be both futile and personally costly. He accommodates Burns because accommodation is the only rational response available to him. This dynamic, where the political class accommodates rather than confronts concentrated private power because the costs of confrontation exceed any politician's individual capacity to bear them, is again not a Springfield invention. It describes something recognizable about how local politics actually functions in communities dominated by major employers. The show's treatment of Springfield's media is equally pointed. The local television news, anchored by Kent Brockman, is a vehicle for the manufacture of consent rather than the provision of information. Brockman, who has been covering Springfield for over 30 years, has developed a specific relationship with truth that is worth examining. Early Brockman is a straightforward media satire, a shallow, vain television personality more interested in his own image than in the stories he is supposed to be covering. But later Brockman episodes reveal a figure who is aware of the gap between what he is presenting and what is actually happening, who occasionally breaks through the professional performance to say something true, and who then retreats back into the performance when the implications of the truth become inconvenient. Brockman's relationship with the story of Springfield's contamination is particularly telling. He has covered events across many episodes that are directly related to the nuclear plant's effects on the town. He has reported on Blinky, on various plant-related incidents, on environmental concerns, and each time, his coverage does exactly what effective media capture looks like in practice. It frames the story in a way that generates attention without generating action, that satisfies the audience's desire to be informed without providing the kind of sustained, contextual coverage that would actually shift public awareness. You do not need to prove media capture to explain this. You need only note that Brockman, like every other Springfield institution, operates within the Burns-dominated environment, and that environment exerts pressure on every institution within it toward outcomes that serve Burns's continued operation. Whether Brockman is consciously serving Burns's interests or simply absorbing the ambient pressure of his environment and producing content that happens to align with those interests is a distinction that matters less than the result. The result is a media environment that tells Springfield it is being watched over, while allowing the things that should be watched over to continue undisturbed. Fat Tony and Springfield's organized crime dimension add another layer to the power map that is worth exploring, because the show establishes the mob's relationship with Springfield's legitimate institutions in ways that are more complex than the comedy around Fat Tony might suggest. Fat Tony, whose real name is Marion Anthony D'Amico, is the head of Springfield's organized crime community. He appears in multiple episodes across many seasons, usually in contexts that establish his genuine power alongside his comedy. He is a man who gets things done through channels that the legitimate economy cannot or will not use, a man whose relationships with the city's formal institutions are managed through money and occasionally through more direct forms of persuasion. The interesting thing about Fat Tony in the context of Burns's empire is the show's suggestion that the two power structures coexist and occasionally cooperate. There are episodes that establish Springfield's mob as having arrangements with city officials, with the police, with the courts. These arrangements run parallel to Burns's arrangements with the same institutions, which raises the question of how these two power structures relate to each other. The answer the show suggests, without quite making explicit, is that they operate in separate domains without direct competition. Burns controls the formal economy, the legitimate institutions, the daylight infrastructure of civic life. Fat Tony operates in the spaces where the formal economy does not reach: the informal labor market, the illegal goods and services sector, the resolution of disputes that formal institutions cannot or will not address. They do not compete because they are not trying to control the same things. This division of labor between legitimate and illegitimate power structures is, again, not a Springfield invention. It describes a model of city governance that historians of American organized crime have documented extensively, where the mob and the established power structure maintain a tacit arrangement that allows both to function. Springfield is a company town run by a centenarian monopolist with a nuclear power plant, a parallel mob economy run by a man who gets his suits tailored, a political class that exists primarily to service both of these power structures, a media establishment that generates the appearance of oversight without the substance, and a medical establishment that is compromised enough to miss or ignore the evidence of what all of the above is doing to the people who live there. This is the power structure of Springfield, and it has been functioning, essentially unchanged, for 36 years. Because the fundamental condition that allows it to function, the cognitive damage, the institutional capture, the collective denial, the geographic ambiguity that prevents consistent regulatory oversight, none of these have been resolved. They persist. The system persists. And Homer Simpson goes to work every morning, parks his car, walks to his console, and does his job, which is to ensure that the specific failures that keep this system running continue to go unfixed. Whether he knows this is, as we have discussed, the question the show never answers directly, but it has given you everything you need to answer it yourself. There is one more dimension of Burns's power that deserves careful attention before we leave this section: the way he manages time. Burns has been in his current position for over a century. He has watched administrations change, technologies emerge and become obsolete, social movements rise and fall, the world transform around him in ways that would disorient anyone operating on a normal human timeline. He has not been disoriented by this. He has used it. One of the most underappreciated aspects of Burns's power is the advantage that longevity gives in the management of information. Burns knows where the bodies are buried, literally in some cases, and figuratively in virtually all of them, because he was present when they were buried. He knows which institutions were built with compromised foundations because he helped build them that way. He knows which agreements were made and with whom because he made them. He has the institutional memory of Springfield's entire modern history in his personal experience, and this memory is a form of power that cannot be acquired quickly, that can only be accumulated through time. This is why the revolving door of Springfield's other power figures does not threaten Burns's position. Mayors come and go, police chiefs are replaced, judges retire. The stonecutters themselves have members who age out and are replaced. But Burns is always there, always the anchor of the longest continuous relationship with Springfield's power structures, always the person who can say, "I remember when," and have that memory be both a source of information and a form of implicit threat. The history of Springfield is partly a history of things that Burns once kept quiet, and Burns has survived long enough that he is practically the last person who knows what those things are. Smithers deserves his own treatment in this section because he is one of the show's most fascinating figures, and the nature of his relationship with Burns is more complex and more interesting than the comedy premise of Devoted Assistant suggests. Waylon Smithers has been Burns's personal assistant, executive secretary, and all-purpose enabler for the show's entire run. He manages Burns's schedule, executes Burns's instructions, facilitates Burns's schemes, and, crucially, administers the weekly radiation treatments that keep Burns functional. He is, in the most literal possible sense, the mechanism by which Burns stays alive. This creates a specific kind of power dynamic that the show depicts with more nuance than it initially appears to. Smithers is not simply devoted to Burns out of blind loyalty. He is the person who understands most completely what Burns actually is, who knows about the treatments and their necessity, who understands the specific fragility underneath Burns's apparent invulnerability. Smithers has information that would destroy Burns if deployed. He has chosen, consistently, not to deploy it. Why? The show has explored multiple dimensions of this question. Smithers's feelings for Burns are genuine and complex, a kind of love that the show depicts honestly as unrequited and painful, but also as real, as the defining emotional experience of his life. But love alone does not explain the totality of Smithers's devotion, because Smithers is not unintelligent. He can see Burns clearly. He knows what Burns is capable of. He has witnessed Burns's cruelty and indifference and comprehensive disregard for other people, including, on many occasions, Smithers himself. What Smithers has, beyond the love, is purpose. Burns gives Smithers's life a structure and a function that nothing else in Springfield could provide. Smithers is extraordinarily capable, far more capable than his role as an assistant reveals. His organizational intelligence, his ability to manage complex logistics, his understanding of how institutions work and how to navigate them, these are rare and valuable. In any other context, in any functional meritocracy, Smithers would have a career that reflected his actual abilities. In Springfield, his abilities are entirely consumed by the project of keeping one ancient man alive and operational. There is something about this that mirrors what Burns did to Homer on a much larger and more deliberate scale. Homer's capabilities were systematically suppressed by a combination of environmental damage and institutional arrangement that kept him exactly where Burns needed him. Smithers's capabilities are consumed by a devotion that keeps him exactly where Burns needs him. Both men are more than their situation allows them to be, and both situations serve Burns's interests. Burns, as the organizing principle of Springfield's human resource allocation, is a darker reading of his character than the cartoon villain surface suggests. He does not just control the economy. He consumes human potential. The people most directly in his orbit, Homer and Smithers, are both examples of what happens when a specific kind of concentrated power is allowed to organize the people around it entirely according to its own needs. Springfield's court system is worth a brief examination before we leave this section, because it functions as one of the most explicit illustrations of how Burns's power is embedded in the town's formal institutions. The Springfield judiciary has been depicted across multiple episodes, and the picture it builds over time is of a legal system that functions primarily as a formality a set of procedures that produces the appearance of impartial justice while actually producing outcomes that reflect the existing power distribution of the community. Judges are appointed through processes that Burns influences. Lawyers capable of actually challenging his interests do not practice in Springfield. The juries that decide cases involving powerful Springfield interests are drawn from a population whose cognitive capacity for sustained analytical reasoning, as we have already discussed, is compromised. This is not a conspiracy in the paranoid sense. It does not require explicit coordination or deliberate planning. It is simply what happens when one entity controls enough of a community's resources for long enough. The legal system shapes itself around the power that funds it, without anyone needing to explicitly instruct it to do so. The adjustment is institutional, automatic, the natural behavior of institutions that depend on concentrated resources and that have learned over time what kinds of outcomes the people controlling those resources prefer. Springfield's justice is not blind, it is purchased. And because the purchase happened so long ago and so thoroughly, nobody remembers that it was purchased, and nobody except Burns is old enough to know when the transaction occurred. The Simpsons has been, across its entire run, a show that deals with mental health. Not always explicitly, not always consciously, but consistently. The interior lives of its characters, the way they process and fail to process the things that happen to them, the coping mechanisms they develop and deploy and sometimes abandon, all of this is material the show has been working with since its first season. What makes this unusual is that the show has always packaged this material inside comedy, inside the specific conventions of a primetime animated sitcom, in ways that make it easy to miss the seriousness of what is being depicted. The comedy is genuine and the material is genuine, and they coexist in a way that sometimes allows the comedy to obscure the full weight of what it is sitting on top of. Homer's psychological profile is the most extensively documented in the show, and it deserves examination beyond the comedy premise. Homer exhibits, across the show's run, a constellation of behaviors that clinical literature associates with several different conditions. His impulsivity, his inability to foresee consequences, his tendency to take actions without thinking through their implications, these are consistent with attention-related difficulties. His periodic inability to regulate his emotional responses, the rage that arrives suddenly and subsides just as quickly, the extreme euphoria that is equally unpredictable, these suggest difficulties with mood regulation. His relationship with food, which the show depicts as compulsive and as functioning as a form of emotional management, is consistent with patterns associated with anxiety and emotional dysregulation. His relationship with alcohol is interesting and is handled with more complexity than it sometimes appears to receive. Homer drinks a lot. Moe's Tavern is practically a second home. The show depicts this drinking as a feature of his social life, as part of how Homer functions as a character, and the comedy typically surrounds the content of what he does while drunk rather than the drinking itself. But there are episodes that look directly at Homer's relationship with alcohol in a less comfortable light. The episode in which Marge addresses her concern about his drinking, and Homer spends a period trying to drink less, and experiencing what the show depicts with some accuracy as the specific misery of moderating behavior that has become compulsive, is one of the show's more honest moments on this topic. The difficulty Homer has is not presented as a moral failing. It is presented as a real difficulty, one that requires genuine effort and that does not resolve easily. The show's handling of Marge's psychology, which we touched on earlier, extends into territory that is worth exploring more fully here. Marge's tendency to suppress her feelings is one of her defining characteristics. The show has explored this in various ways, but one of the most sustained explorations comes through her relationship with gambling, which is depicted in one season 5 episode with remarkable seriousness for a comedy show. Marge develops a gambling problem. She becomes addicted to the slot machines at the new casino that has opened in Springfield. The episode tracks her addiction with a specificity and an empathy that is unusual for television treatment of gambling addiction. The show does not make her addiction funny. It does not frame her compulsive gambling as a character flaw or a moral weakness. It frames it as a response to the specific pressures of her life, as a space where she has control and stimulation and a kind of focused engagement that her ordinary domestic life does not provide. The connection between addiction and suppressed self is not stated explicitly, but is structured carefully into the episode. Marge is addicted to gambling because gambling gives her something that her role as wife and mother systematically denies her, an experience that is entirely her own, with consequences that are hers alone, in a space where the complex web of family obligation temporarily does not apply. Understanding addiction as a response to specific psychological deficits rather than as a character flaw was, in 1993 when this episode aired, a more progressive clinical framework than most of the culture had adopted. The show was ahead of the conversation. It was depicting something that the mainstream discourse about addiction had not yet caught up to. Marge also experiences, in various episodes, what can be identified as anxiety at a level that goes beyond ordinary worry. Her catastrophic thinking, her tendency to assume negative outcomes, and to carry contingency plans for disasters that do not materialize. Her difficulty with uncertainty and change. These are consistent with generalized anxiety that is managed through control, specifically through the kind of domestic control that her role as the family's primary caretaker provides. The house on Evergreen Terrace is Marge's anxiety management system as much as it is a home. Keeping the house clean and ordered, maintaining routines, knowing where everything and everyone is, these are strategies for containing the anxiety that would otherwise be unbridgeable. The comedy of Marge's occasional excessive tidiness, or excessive planning, is covering something that is not primarily funny. Ned Flanders, as discussed briefly in an earlier section, is one of the show's most psychologically rich characters, and the fullness of his psychology becomes clear when you hold together everything the show has revealed about him across 36 years. The childhood behavioral modification that the show reveals in the Season 8 episode Hurricane Nettie is the key that unlocks everything else about Ned. A violent, uncontrollable child was subjected to years of intensive behavioral therapy that suppressed his aggression so thoroughly that he lost access not just to his anger, but to the broader emotional range that anger is part of. What was conditioned out of Ned was not just his violence, but his authentic emotional responsiveness. This is a specific and accurate description of certain outcomes in behavioral therapy conducted without sufficient attention to the complexity of what is being modified. You cannot suppress just anger. Anger is connected to fear, to love, to motivation, to the experience of wrong. If you succeed in suppressing anger comprehensively, you suppress the emotional territory around it as well, and you produce someone who can no longer respond authentically to a wide range of experience. This is Ned. His positivity, his patience, his relentless kindness are not authentic responses to his experience. They are the outputs of a system that cannot produce authentic responses because it was designed to suppress one specific authentic response and succeeded too thoroughly. The faith that fills the space where authentic emotional responsiveness used to be is not the faith of a person who has encountered the divine and been transformed by it. It is the faith of a person who needs an external framework to make sense of a life that cannot make sense on its own terms, of a person whose happiness depends on the belief that the suffering he experiences is meaningful because a benevolent cosmic order has purposes he cannot see. When things go wrong for Ned, as they consistently do, as they catastrophically do with Maud's death, the coping framework is tested in ways it was not designed to withstand. The behavioral conditioning can suppress anger, but it cannot suppress grief. Grief is not anger, it is something more fundamental, and it comes through the cracks in Ned's psychological structure in ways that reveal how fragile that structure actually is. There is a specific sequence in the aftermath of Maud's death that captures this clearly. Ned, trying to process his loss, attempts to date again at Springfield's suggestion and with Springfield's eager facilitation. The awkwardness of these attempts is played for comedy, but the emotional reality underneath the comedy is a man who was not allowed by his own psychology to feel angry about what happened, who cannot therefore move through anger toward whatever is on the other side of it. His grief is stuck. The path through it requires an emotional capacity he was conditioned to not have. The darkness the show points toward with Ned, and then stops short of, is the possibility that his entire religious and ethical structure is a magnificent piece of denial, a constructed system of meaning that serves the same function that Homer's stupidity serves. It prevents the person inside it from clearly seeing the nature of their situation. Ned is, in a specific sense, as cognitively limited by his conditioning as Homer is by the crayon and the radiation. The limitation is different in character and in origin. The functional result, a person who cannot clearly perceive their own circumstances and therefore cannot act effectively to change them, is similar. Springfield's collective psychology, The town as a psychological entity is worth considering as a conclusion to this section. The collective behaviors of Springfield's population, the forgetting, the denial, the voting to maintain comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths, the willingness to exile anyone who insists on accuracy, these are not just political or sociological observations. They are psychological observations about how communities under sustained stress develop protective mechanisms. Communities experiencing environmental contamination, economic dependence on a single source, institutional corruption that cannot be addressed through normal civic channels, the kind of community, in other words, that Springfield is, tend to develop specific psychological responses to their situation. These responses prioritize stability over accuracy, collective coherence over individual truth, the maintenance of shared narrative over the documentation of what is actually happening. The clinical literature on communities experiencing environmental contamination describes patterns that map onto Springfield with unsettling precision. The minimization of health effects, the attribution of observable problems to causes other than the obvious one, the social pressure against people who raise concerns, the development of a community identity that is incompatible with acknowledging the contamination because the community's economic survival depends on the contaminating industry. Springfield is not unique. Springfield is a portrait of something that has existed in many real American communities, in areas where the major employer was also the major polluter, where the economic need and the health damage were inseparably linked, where the psychological cost of seeing clearly was more than the community could afford to pay. The comedy is how the show makes it watchable, but the diagnosis is real. There is one more psychological dimension that this section has not yet addressed: the specific psychology of Springfield's children, who are growing up inside all of the systems we have described. Bart Simpson is growing up in an environment where institutional authority is either absent, corrupt, or actively hostile to his development. His school does not believe in him. His principal is not who he says he is. His teacher has written him off. The town's police department is a comedy of dysfunction that would provide no safety in a genuine emergency. The primary role model available to him from the adult world of employment and civic participation is his father, a man who survives through a combination of extraordinary luck and cognitive limitation. What Bart is learning from all of this is that institutions cannot be trusted, that authority is performance rather than substance, that the rules that supposedly govern the world are applied selectively and capriciously and primarily to the disadvantage of people who do not have the resources to evade them. He is learning this at 10 years old, in the specific way that children learn things, which is not through analysis but through accumulated experience. His pranks and his defiance and his refusal to submit to institutional expectations are not, from this perspective, simply the behavior of a difficult child. They are a rational response to a world that has consistently demonstrated that submission to its demands produces nothing of value. If the school will not teach you, why would you submit to the school's authority over your time? If the rules do not protect you, why would you follow rules? Bart's rebelliousness is, at its core, a more accurate read of his environment than his educator's insistence that compliance would benefit him. Lisa is learning something adjacent but different. She is learning that the institutions that are supposed to reward intelligence and ethical commitment fail to do so consistently. She is learning that the world does not respond to being improved upon with gratitude, that the people who point out what is wrong tend to receive the same social costs as people who cause what is wrong. She is learning that caring deeply about things is socially costly in ways that not caring is not. And yet she keeps caring. This is, depending on how you read it, either her greatest strength or her defining tragedy. Lisa, at 8 years old, is already fighting battles she will spend her entire frozen life fighting, against an environment that will not change, in service of a world that will not improve, with the specific kind of stubborn idealism that only remains intact when it is never given the chance to be extinguished by consequences. The floating timeline protects her from the consequences of sustained futility. She never has to face a version of herself that has finally given up. She is always 8, always fighting, always convinced that this time the world might respond differently. Springfield's children are being formed by the most deforming possible environment, and the show freezes them in the moment before the formation fully takes, before we have to see what they become. The coma theory, again, offers the kindest explanation. Homer cannot bear to imagine his children as the adults this environment would make them. He holds them at the ages they were, hopeful and unbroken, because those are the children he can love without grief. What they are becoming, in the real Springfield, is a question the show has the mercy not to answer. One of the most consistent psychological dynamics in the show that rarely gets examined directly is the way that Springfield's residents relate to hope. Not hope in the grand sense of political aspiration or collective change, but the small daily hope that things might go slightly better today than they went yesterday, that the situation might improve in some incremental way, that the arc of an ordinary life might bend towards something more comfortable than what came before. Springfield's residents hope constantly. Homer hopes that today will be the day Burns remembers his name, or that Marge will not be too disappointed by something he has done, or that a scheme he has devised will produce the result it was designed to produce, rather than the result that schemes in Springfield typically produce. Ned hopes that his faith will be rewarded in some tangible way, that the universe will confirm its own justice through an event in his life. Marge hopes that the family will be okay, in the broadest possible sense, that the specific catastrophe she is currently managing will be the last one for a while. These hopes are, almost without exception, disappointed. Not catastrophically, not in ways that destroy the person hoping, but in the specific, gentle way that Springfield specializes in. The situation improves just enough that it can be called improvement, and then something else goes wrong, and the cycle continues at the same low-grade level indefinitely. This pattern is one of the reasons the show sustains itself episodically. Each episode begins with a new hope, a new scheme, a new situation that might resolve in a way that improves someone's circumstances. Each episode ends with a reset, a return to the baseline that leaves everyone more or less where they started. The hope was real, the disappointment was real. Both will happen again next week, with the same characters hoping for different things and experiencing the same gentle ratio of small progress and quiet defeat. Clinical psychologists studying learned helplessness, the condition that develops in organisms repeatedly exposed to situations they cannot control, describe a pattern that maps onto Springfield's population precisely. Learned helplessness produces, over time, a reduction in the effort an organism puts into attempting to change its circumstances, not because the organism is unintelligent, but because it has learned, through accumulated experience, that effort does not reliably produce the outcome. The effort continues, but it becomes less focused, less connected to genuine belief that it will work. Homer's schemes are learned helplessness in action. He attempts things, they do not work. He attempts more things, they do not work. He never fully stops trying, because the show needs him to try, but his trying has the quality of a man who does not expect to succeed, who is going through the motions of agency in a world that has trained him to expect defeat while withholding just enough small victories to keep him from giving up entirely. Springfield runs on managed hope. The hope is real, the management is precise, and the result is a population that keeps participating in a system that will not substantially change because the system has learned, over 36 years, exactly how much improvement to dispense to keep its participants engaged. There is one more figure whose psychology this section cannot leave out. Moe Szyslak, who is in some ways the show's most sustained portrait of a specific kind of loneliness that American culture produces and then ignores. Moe has run his tavern for the show's entire run. He is the person Springfield's men go to when they need to be somewhere that is not home, when they need the specific comfort of a familiar chair and a familiar glass and a familiar face that has seen them at their worst and did not make too much of it. His bar is a refuge. His function in Springfield's social ecology is to provide a space where men can be unhappy without being required to explain their unhappiness or work on it or resolve it. This function is real and it is genuinely valuable in a community like Springfield, where the institutional resources for processing emotional difficulty are mostly absent or broken. Moe's Tavern is not a good solution to the problems its patrons bring through its door, but it is a solution, which is more than most of the town's official institutions can say. Moe himself has, across multiple episodes, been given storylines that reveal his interior life with surprising depth. He has had relationships that came close to working and then did not. He has had moments of genuine self-examination that arrived at genuinely dark conclusions. He has attempted suicide, not as a comedy beat but as the expression of a level of despair that the show treated, in those specific moments, with unusual seriousness. The suicide attempts are always interrupted. Someone arrives or something happens, and Moe is redirected from the edge and the episode continues. This is partly the show's comfort with the comedy potential of near suicides as interruptions, a dark and not entirely comfortable comedic tradition. But it is also something else. The show's refusal to fully resolve the darkness it has introduced into Moe's character by following it to its conclusion. Moe is always pulled back. He is never allowed to either succeed or to genuinely recover. He exists in the perpetual middle ground of someone who is suffering without being allowed to either escape or improve. This perpetual middle ground is, again, exactly what the floating timeline enforces. Moe cannot recover because recovery would mean change, and change is not available in Springfield's temporal structure. He cannot reach the end of his despair because that end would also be a change the format cannot accommodate. He is held in the specific misery the show established for him, episode after episode, because holding him there is what the format requires. The tragedy of Moe Seislak is therefore a formal tragedy as much as a character tragedy. He is not suffering because of who he is. He is suffering because of what the show needs him to be, a constant, a fixed point in Springfield's emotional landscape, the man who is always there behind the bar when Homer needs somewhere to go. His suffering is the price of his function. Springfield could not run without Moe. Moe cannot stop hurting without ceasing to be Moe. So he keeps hurting, and the bar stays open, and Homer keeps coming in, and the town keeps running on the specific fuel of Moe's unresolvable pain. If you look at Springfield's population and identify the people who are carrying the most weight so that others can carry less, Moe is near the top of that list. He absorbs, he provides, he stays. And he receives very little in return except the continued presence of people who need what he offers, which is not nothing, but is not nearly enough. We have reached the bottom of the iceberg. The water here is cold and dark, and the light from the surface is barely visible. The things that exist at this depth are not facts about the show exactly, or not only facts about the show. They are reflections, the show seeing itself, the audience seeing the show seeing itself, and in that hall of mirrors, something that might be closer to the truth than anything at the shallower levels. Let us begin with the question of what it means that The Simpsons is still running. The show has outlasted its creative peak by a measure that no other long-running television series has matched. There is a general consensus, even among the show's defenders and its creators, that the golden era ended somewhere in the late 90s or early 2000s, that the seasons produced since then have been, with occasional exceptions, a diminished version of what the show was at its best. This has been true for over 20 years. The Simpsons has been past its creative peak for longer than many television series run in their entirety. It is, by the consensus of its own fan base, a lesser version of itself, and it has been a lesser version of itself for most of this century. And yet it continues. New episodes are produced, broadcast, and watched. The cast reports to the recording studio. The animation team produces 30 or so episodes per year. The show's cultural apparatus, the licensing, the merchandise, the cultural conversation around its legacy continues to generate significant revenue. Why does it continue? The commercial answer is simple enough. It is profitable to continue. The show's legacy gives it an audience even in its reduced form, and the economic infrastructure around it has been running long enough to sustain itself through momentum. Fox's relationship with the show is the relationship of an institution with one of its most significant assets, and institutions are not good at letting go of significant assets even when the case for doing so would be rational. But there is another answer, one that sits at this deep level of the iceberg, and that is harder to articulate. The Simpsons continues because America needs it to continue. This sounds like hyperbole. It is meant seriously. The show, over 36 years, has become something that transcends its status as a television program. It has become a shared reference point for multiple generations of Americans. It has become part of the language, the way certain phrases and images and situations that originated in the show have migrated into general usage and general consciousness in ways that no longer require knowledge of the show to deploy. It has become a container for a specific version of American experience. The working-class family, the company town, the gap between the American dream and the American reality, the persistence of ordinary life under extraordinary pressure. Letting the show end would mean letting that container close. It would mean admitting that the version of America the show depicts, the one that was true enough to resonate with millions of people for 3.5 decades, is over or is changing into something the old format can no longer contain. America is not good at those admissions. The show runs because the alternative to the show running is something the culture has not decided it is ready to face. The acknowledgement that the era the show represents has passed, that the world Homer and Marge inhabit, the world of the nuclear family in the middle-class suburb with the fixed employment and the modest economic stability, is not the world that most Americans live in anymore, and has not been for some time. Homer's job at the nuclear plant is a form of employment that has largely ceased to exist in the American economy. The stability it represents, the guaranteed employment with pension and healthcare at a company you might spend your entire career at, has been eroded so thoroughly over the past 40 years that depicting it as ordinary rather than exceptional is already an act of nostalgia. The Simpsons has been nostalgia for the specific economic security of a certain version of American mid-century life for longer than that version of American life has actually existed. We watch it because we want to believe it is still real. We watch it because Homer going to work every day and coming home to his family on Evergreen Terrace is a comfort. Not despite its fictional nature, but because of it. Fiction can maintain things that reality cannot. Fiction can hold the working-class family together, with its house and its steady income and its neighborhood full of characters who have been there for decades, in a way that the real economy of the 21st century does not. Springfield is the America that America wants to still be, maintained in amber, impossible to lose as long as the show keeps running. The prediction phenomenon belongs at this deepest level of the iceberg because it forces a specific question that the comfortable explanations do not fully answer. The comfortable explanation, which we have already examined and which is accurate as far as it goes, is that The Simpsons produced enough satirical content over enough years that some of it was statistically bound to align with future events, and that confirmation bias leads people to remember the hits and forget the misses. This is a real and valid explanation. It is not the complete story. The incomplete part of the story is this. The Simpsons writing staff, at its peak, included people who were engaged in systematic thinking about the direction of American culture in ways that most other television writers were not. They were not just writing jokes. They were analyzing trajectories. They were following the logic of existing trends to their endpoints. They were asking what the world would look like if current dynamics were allowed to continue operating without interruption. This is a recognizable intellectual practice. Scenario planning, trend extrapolation, futures thinking, these are the tools of people who think professionally about where systems are heading. The Simpsons writers were not doing these things formally, but they were doing versions of them intuitively, in the process of generating satirical content that required understanding not just what was happening now, but what was plausibly implied by what was happening now. When you do this systematically across 36 years of episodes touching every significant dimension of American life, you produce a body of work that maps, in detailed and often surprisingly accurate form, the space of possible American futures. Some of those futures arrived, some did not. The ones that arrived look like predictions. They are better described as the natural output of sustained, intelligent attention to the present. The Trump prediction is the clearest example. The show did not predict a Trump presidency through clairvoyance. It predicted it through the application of the following logic. Celebrity culture is becoming increasingly intertwined with political culture. Wealthy celebrities with strong name recognition and a willingness to perform populist sentiment have structural advantages in this environment. Trump has been performing this particular act for over 2 decades. The structural advantages of celebrity politics, allowed to run their course, produce something like a Trump presidency. This is a chain of reasoning that was available to anyone paying close enough attention in the year 2000. The writers paid close attention. They followed the reasoning. They wrote a joke about where it led. 16 years later, the joke arrived. The deeply strange part, the part that belongs at the bottom of the iceberg, is what this says about the relationship between satire and reality. Satire works by taking a real thing and amplifying or distorting it in ways that reveal something about the real thing that straight description cannot achieve. When the distorted version then arrives as reality, the relationship between the satire and the thing it is satirizing collapses. The commentary and the thing being commented on become the same thing. This is what happened with the Trump prediction. Springfield's joke presidency became America's actual presidency. The satirical exaggeration was an accurate forecast. And the question this raises, which the iceberg has no clean answer to, is whether the show's satire helped produce the reality it depicted by making that reality feel imaginable, even familiar, to an audience that had processed it as comedy for 16 years. This is the cultural scaffolding argument at its most unsettling. If The Simpsons made a Trump presidency feel like a recognizable joke rather than an incomprehensible shock, did the show reduce the psychic resistance that might otherwise have made that outcome less likely? Did the comedy make the catastrophe easier to accept because we had already rehearsed it in the safe space of fiction? These are questions the show's writers have addressed with characteristic discomfort and brevity. They do not have clean answers. They are the kind of questions that arise when a piece of cultural work operates at the scale and across the duration that The Simpsons has, when it becomes impossible to trace the specific influence of a specific piece of content on a specific outcome. The show is too large and too old and too embedded in American consciousness for that kind of specific accounting. But the questions do not go away. They sit at the bottom of the iceberg, in the cold, dark water, asking themselves, the final meta-theory at this deepest level is the one that connects all the others, and that is, in some ways, the only theory the iceberg requires. The Simpsons, across 36 years and 800 episodes, has been building a portrait, not of a cartoon family or a fictional town, but of something larger and harder to name. The portrait is of America's relationship with the comfortable lie, the agreed-upon fiction that everything is basically fine, that the systems work well enough, that the family is intact, and the job is stable, and the water is clean, and the children will grow up into a world that rewards their merit. The Simpsons knows this is a lie. It has known from the beginning. Springfield is a contaminated town run by a corrupt plutocrat, full of people who have been cognitively impaired by their environment, and who maintain their community's comfortable self-image through systematic forgetting and collective denial. The lie is visible in every episode if you know where to look. The radiation, the power structure, the institutional capture, the blank psychological damage, it is all there. And the show keeps making it funny. The tragedy keeps getting delivered as comedy, the indictment keeps arriving dressed as a joke, and the audience keeps laughing, which is what the audience was invited to do, which is the right response and also the compromised response, because laughter is the mechanism by which Springfield's residents protect themselves from the truth of their situation, and laughter is the mechanism by which the show's audience does the same. We laugh because it is easier than the alternative. The alternative is to look at Springfield clearly and recognize it, to see the contamination and the corruption and the damage and the collective denial, and to say, this is real. This is where we live. Not Springfield specifically, but the structure Springfield represents. The comfortable lie maintained at collective expense, the billionaire whose survival depends on our not asking questions, the children frozen at ages where they cannot yet demand accountability. The show has been telling us this for 36 years. And we have been laughing for 36 years. And the plant keeps running. And Homer keeps going to work. And the fish have 3 eyes. And nobody asks why. This is not a conspiracy or a theory. It is a description of what the show has become and what function it serves. And it explains why, despite 36 seasons, despite seasons of clearly diminished quality, despite the creative exhaustion visible in the material, the show continues and will probably continue for as long as someone is willing to fund it. Because ending it means admitting something, and the admission is too heavy to make. The show's relationship with its own history, with the archive of itself that 36 years of production has created, becomes more complex and more interesting as the archive grows. The early seasons of The Simpsons established a Springfield that was specific and internally consistent in ways that later seasons have not always honored. The characters were drawn with precision. The world they inhabited had rules. The jokes were constructed with care. And the relationship between all of these elements, the characters, the world, the jokes, had a coherence that gave the whole thing the quality of a real place, a real community with a real history. Later seasons have been in various relationships with that established history. Some episodes honor it meticulously, reaching back into the archive for callbacks and connections that reward the attentive long-term viewer. Others treat the established character history as more or less irrelevant to the current episode's needs, producing contradictions with earlier material that range from minor to fundamental. The accumulation of these contradictions has created what fans call continuity problems, but which are, at the deeper level, a different kind of problem. They are the evidence of a show that is no longer entirely in control of the thing it created. The Springfield of the current seasons is not quite the same Springfield as the Springfield of the early seasons. They share characters and locations and institutional structures, but the specific texture of the place, the sense of a world with consistent internal logic and consistent emotional reality has changed. What the current show maintains is the shell of Springfield. The recognizable elements, the characters' names and voices and visual designs, the recurring settings, the thematic preoccupations. What it does not always maintain is the inner coherence that made those elements meaningful in the first place. This is a familiar trajectory for long-running creative projects. They generate a world, and then they inhabit it for long enough that the world becomes larger than any individual group of people can fully hold in their heads simultaneously, and then they start working from the surface of the world rather than from its depths, because the depths are now too vast and too complex to navigate confidently. The Simpsons is too big for any writing team to know completely. This is not a criticism. It is a consequence of producing 800 episodes across 36 years. The early show was built by people who knew it completely because they were building it. The current show is maintained by people who know the surface of what was built, and who do their best to honor the depth without always being able to access it directly. There is a concept in architecture that describes what happens to very old buildings over time, the distinction between the original building and the building as it currently exists, after decades of renovation and repair and modification, sometimes becomes hard to draw. The current building occupies the space of the original building. It contains materials from the original building. But the experience of being in the current building is different from the experience of being in the original building, and the difference is not just superficial, it is structural. This is Springfield now. It occupies the space of the original Springfield. It contains materials from the original Springfield. But the experience of being in it is different, and the difference is structural. The meta-theory that connects all of this is one that the show itself has gestured toward across many years, in self-referential moments that are played as jokes but that point towards something more serious. The Simpsons knows it is The Simpsons. Not in the breaking the fourth wall way of a show that makes explicit meta-commentary on its own fictional status. In a subtler way. In the way a show demonstrates that it knows what it is through the specific choices it makes about what to acknowledge and what to refuse to acknowledge, about what it is willing to say explicitly and what it would rather leave in the territory of implication. The show knows it is too long. It has made jokes about being too long. It knows it has changed, and not always for the better. It has made jokes about having changed. It knows that fans of the early seasons view the later seasons with a mixture of loyalty and grief, and it has made jokes about that too. These jokes are something. They are acknowledgments, dressed in comedy, of things the show knows about itself. They are the show looking in the mirror and recognizing what it sees, and then making a joke about the recognition, because the alternative to making a joke is taking the recognition seriously, and taking it seriously would require deciding what to do about it. And the show does not know what to do about it. Or rather, the economic and institutional machinery around the show does know. It continues. The show will continue. It will continue past the point where most of its remaining creative justification can be argued for. It will continue because the alternative is the ending, and the ending is something that cannot be undone. And here's the thing about endings that this iceberg has been building toward. The deepest, coldest thing at the very bottom. Homer Simpson, if the coma theory is correct, is dreaming. His family is frozen in his dream at the ages they were when he went under. His children will never grow up because he was not there to watch them grow up, and his dreaming mind cannot imagine them older than the last moment he saw them. His wife will never leave, because in the dream she cannot leave, because the dream is the act of a mind that loves her too much to generate the possibility of her absence. The show, if the coma theory is correct, ends when Homer wakes up or when Homer dies. And in neither case does the ending feel like a victory. Waking up means 36 years of lost time in a world that has moved on without him. Dying means the dream dissolves and there is nothing. So the dream continues. The loop continues. Bart stays 10. Lisa stays 8. Maggie keeps her pacifier. And Homer keeps dreaming his family into existence, one episode at a time, because the dream is the only place where he has not lost them. The coma theory is not provably true. The show will not confirm it. But it is true in a more important sense. It describes the emotional logic of why the show cannot end. The show cannot end because it is a father's refusal to let go of his family. The format, the floating timeline, the reset between episodes, all of these are the mechanisms by which a man in a hospital bed keeps the world of his love intact. And we, the audience, are complicit. We are the reason the dream continues. Every time we watch, every time we settle into the familiar couch gag and the familiar theme, we are participating in the dream. We are holding it open. We are the collective mind that keeps Springfield running, that keeps Bart at 10 and Lisa at 8 and Homer stumbling through the door at 5:30, because letting it end means something we are not ready to say. We watch this show in specific rooms, at specific ages, with specific people, and some of those rooms are gone now, and some of those ages are far behind us, and some of those people are no longer there to watch with us. The show is not just the show. It is the version of ourselves that watched the show, preserved in the act of watching it again. As long as the show runs, those selves exist somewhere. As long as Springfield is intact, the rooms where we watched it are intact too, in some form that matters even though it cannot be fully articulated. This is what the floating timeline is actually protecting. Not just Homer's children, frozen at 10 and 8 and 1. Our own childhoods, frozen at the moment we first sat down on whatever couch we were sitting on and heard that theme, and watched a family that was not our family but that somehow felt like it could be. There is something that happens when a piece of cultural work achieves the longevity The Simpsons has achieved that is difficult to describe accurately. The show becomes less like a television program and more like a shared language, a set of references and images and phrases that function as communication between people who have internalized them, a shorthand for specific kinds of experience, and specific kinds of humor, and specific kinds of recognition. The Simpsons has been generating this shared language for 36 years. The phrases that originated in it, the references that live in it, the specific scenes and moments and lines that have migrated from the show into ordinary speech and ordinary consciousness, constitute one of the largest single contributions any piece of entertainment has ever made to the informal vocabulary of a culture. People who have not watched the show in 20 years, people who have never watched it seriously, people who encounter it only as cultural background noise, all of these people carry pieces of it. The infiltration is complete in a way that makes it essentially impossible to describe from the outside. This is what cultural dominance actually looks like. Not the active consumption of a piece of media, but its passive presence in the consciousness of people who may not even think of themselves as its audience. Springfield is in the air. It has been in the air for so long that it no longer announces itself as Springfield. It just is. The floating timeline serves this process of cultural infiltration. A show that ages, whose characters grow older and whose world changes with time, eventually becomes a period piece. It becomes something that is about a specific moment, rather than something that lives in an ongoing present. The Simpsons has refused to become a period piece by refusing to allow time to pass inside it. In doing so, it has remained available to each new generation of viewers in a way that period pieces cannot be, not as a document of a specific past moment, but as something that exists in the same present as the viewer. A 12-year-old watching The Simpsons today is watching the same Bart, the same 10-year-old troublemaker, that a 12-year-old watched in 1993. The relationship between the viewer and the character is exactly the same relationship it has always been. The show is not offering a historical recreation. It is offering the genuine article. Bart is genuinely still 10. The experience of watching him is not mediated by nostalgia or historical distance. This is an extraordinary achievement, and it was achieved not through any intentional strategy, but through the specific accident of a format that happened to suit a show that happened to last long enough for the format's properties to become cultural assets. The Simpsons did not plan to be a shared cultural language. It planned to be a good television show. The language emerged from the longevity, and the longevity emerged from the quality, and the quality emerged from a specific combination of talent and circumstance, and creative courage and institutional support that will probably never be assembled in exactly the same way again. What the show has become is not what anyone set out to make. It is something that happened to what they made over 36 years of being watched and rewatched and quoted and discussed and theorized and loved and argued about and dismissed and defended and carried in the heads of an enormous number of people across an enormous span of time. The iceberg is the evidence of all of that. Every theory, every observation, every pattern identified, and every mystery documented is the trace of a human mind that engaged with this material closely enough to see something in it worth recording. The iceberg is not the show. It is the deposit left by the relationship between the show and the people who took it seriously. And that deposit is, in its own way, as remarkable as the show itself. The iceberg goes very deep. We have been down here for a long time. It is late or early, wherever you are. The water is very still at this level. Nothing moves quickly down here. There is one more thing and then we will be done. The Simpsons at its best in those early seasons when everything was firing and the writers were at the height of their collective ability was making something that nobody had made before. It was making a comedy that was also a tragedy, that was also a satire, that was also a love story, that was also a horror story, that was also a document of what it was like to be alive in America at the end of the 20th century. It was doing all of these things simultaneously, in 30 minutes a week, with a cartoon family that had 4 fingers and yellow skin and lived in a town that did not exist on any map. And it could do all of those things simultaneously was because the people making it believed, collectively, that comedy was important enough to be taken seriously, that a joke could carry real weight, that a punchline could be the delivery mechanism for something that would otherwise be too heavy to say directly, that laughter was not the opposite of understanding but a form of it. The iceberg is the record of that belief. All of it, from the surface jokes to the deepest theories, is the record of people who took something seriously and of an audience that took it seriously back. The questions the iceberg raises, the mysteries it documents, the patterns it finds, and the theories it generates, all of this is the accumulated work of people who watched a cartoon family and felt that something real was being said. Something real was being said. That is the last entry on this iceberg. The deepest, simplest, most important one. The show said something real. People heard it. And the hearing, the 36 years of hearing, the 800 episodes of hearing, has produced this. A record so extensive and so detailed and so strange that you can spend 2 hours going through it and feel, at the end, that you have barely touched the surface. Which is true. We have barely touched the surface. There are entire categories of Simpsons analysis that this iceberg has not reached. The linguistics of Springfield, the way the show's language patterns have influenced spoken English in ways that are now so integrated into casual speech that people deploy Simpsons references without knowing they are doing so. D.O. was added to the Oxford English Dictionary in 2001. It is one of the most universally recognizable pieces of audio in the world. The word did not exist before the show, and now it exists everywhere, including in the mouths of people who have never watched a single episode. There is the economics of Springfield, the specific way the show depicts a working-class income trying to support a middle-class lifestyle in a town with above-average costs due to the nuclear plant's monopoly position. Homer's salary, which the show has referenced at various points, is not large enough to explain the family's standard of living. The house on Evergreen Terrace, fully maintained, with 3 children, in a community with a functional bowling alley and a decent bar and multiple healthcare facilities, should require more than a power plant safety inspector makes. The gap between Homer's income and the family's apparent comfort is a persistent background mystery that the show never addresses directly. There is the matter of Springfield's voting patterns, which have been charted by attentive fans across political episodes spanning the show's run, and which paint a complicated picture of a community that is not easily categorized by normal political frameworks. Springfield has elected politicians who espouse wildly contradictory platforms in rapid succession, has voted for initiatives that directly contradict each other in consecutive episodes, and has exhibited collective political behavior that can only be understood as the behavior of a community whose decision-making capacity is compromised at the source. There is the Springfield Police Department, which deserves its own extended treatment and which exists as a portrait of American law enforcement dysfunction that is simultaneously too funny to take entirely seriously and too accurate to dismiss as exaggeration. Chief Wiggum is a figure of comedy. He is also a fairly precise portrait of the specific mechanisms by which a law enforcement institution can be simultaneously well-funded and operationally useless when its primary organizational goal is the protection of the comfortable and the containment of the uncomfortable rather than the application of actual law. There is the Springfield Elementary School, which trains children primarily in how to manage within a failing institution. The education provided at Springfield Elementary does not primarily produce educated people. It produces people who have learned how to navigate the gap between what an institution says it is doing and what it is actually doing, which is a different kind of education and not an entirely useless one. though it is not what anyone would choose if they had the choice. There is Krusty the Clown, who is one of the most fully realized portraits of specific entertainment industry dysfunction in the show's history, a man who has spent his entire life performing a version of himself for an audience, and who has lost track of whether the performer or the performance is the real person, who medicates this confusion with a combination of substances and commerce, who is capable of genuine warmth toward the children who love him, and equally capable of complete indifference to their welfare, who is, in other words, the entertainment industry itself, rendered in grease paint and given a talk show. There is Apu and the show's complicated history with his character, which began as a specific and affectionately drawn portrait of a specific kind of immigrant experience in American retail culture, and which evolved in ways that produced a genuine and legitimate cultural conversation about representation, about who gets to tell which stories, about the difference between affectionate caricature and harmful stereotype. That conversation, which The Simpsons initiated not by intention but by longevity, is one of the show's most important contributions to the ongoing American conversation about what comedy is allowed to do and to whom. There are the one-episode characters, dozens and hundreds of them across 36 years, each one the vehicle for a specific joke or a specific observation about a specific aspect of American life, and collectively a portrait of America's human diversity, more detailed and more honest than most prestige dramas manage. The Simpsons is, among other things, the largest single repository of jokes about the specific texture of American daily life that has ever been created. Every job, every social situation, every type of community event, every category of neighborhood conflict, every variety of institutional failure, it is all in there somewhere. We have been in Springfield for a long time tonight. We have walked its streets and entered its buildings and looked carefully at things that most visitors miss. We have examined the water and found it compromised. We have looked at the plant and understood, finally, what it is and what it does. We have listened to the family in their house on Evergreen Terrace and heard, underneath the jokes and the noise, something quieter and truer and more important. What we have found is not a cartoon. It never was. What we found is a mirror that was held up to a specific version of America for 36 years and that reflected back, in the specific distortion of comedy, something more accurate than most American culture allows itself to be. Springfield is damaged and beautiful. It is compromised and beloved. It is a contaminated dream that a man in a hospital bed keeps alive because the alternative to the dream is too heavy to face. And we have been sitting outside that hospital, in some way, for 36 years tuning in to hear how the dream is going, relieved every week when the family is still intact, and the house is still standing and nobody has had to say goodbye yet. That is what the show is. That is what it has always been. Not a comedy exactly, not a tragedy exactly, but the space in between those things, where the true stuff lives, the material that is too real to be only funny, and too funny to be only real. The iceberg does not end here. It extends downward into territory we have not visited, into the individual memories of everyone who has ever watched the show and felt something that did not quite have a name, into the specific rooms and specific moments and specific ages at which specific people encountered specific episodes and were changed in ways they may not have fully tracked. Those memories are the deepest layer. They are not on any iceberg diagram. They are not theory or analysis or production history. They are the evidence of the show's most fundamental achievement. It gave millions of people a world to live in, briefly, when they needed one. It is still doing that tonight. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, whatever is waiting for you on the other side of this video. The water at this depth is very still. There is no current here. There is no urgency. There is only the quiet hum of a town that has been running for 36 years. The same yellow faces in the same yellow light, the same problems cycling through their familiar shapes, the same family finding their way back to each other at the end of every episode, as though that finding matters, as though the fact of being together in the same house, on the same street, at the end of the day is worth documenting, worth returning to, worth protecting from the ordinary erosion of time. It is worth all of that. It has always been worth all of that. That is what the show has been saying underneath everything, through all the satire and the darkness and the conspiracy and the beauty. That the ordinary life, the modest life, the life of a family in a house in a town where nothing particularly remarkable ever happens except everything, is worth paying attention to, is worth loving. is worth telling stories about for 36 years. Homer is still in there, somewhere, in his hospital room or his house on Evergreen Terrace or both simultaneously, dreaming the dream that keeps his family together. Bart is still 10. Lisa is still 8. Maggie is still watching, still waiting, still carrying whatever she is carrying behind those enormous quiet eyes. The plant is still running. Burns is still alive. The water is still compromised. And nobody has asked about the fish. But somewhere in Springfield, in a house on Evergreen Terrace, a light is on. The television is playing. The family is together. Homer fell asleep on the couch again. Marge pulled a blanket over him without waking him. Bart is somewhere he is not supposed to be, doing something that will be funny in retrospect. Lisa is reading something that will change how she understands the world, which will change nothing about the world, but will change everything about how she moves through it. And Maggie is watching all of it, quiet and awake and present, taking careful note of everything that everyone else has missed. And for now, for tonight, that is enough. Springfield will be here, the loop will hold, Homer will dream, the couch gag will play, the theme will start, the family will run through the door and land on the cushions, and the television will flicker on, and it will be a Sunday night in Springfield, and everything will be exactly as it was. Sleep well.